Hello everyone, if you enjoy this video, please hit that like button, drop a comment below, and don't forget to subscribe. I'm on a mission to reach 1,000 subscribers, and your support means the world to me, and let's get started. If you step back in time, centuries before the gunfire of the 1950s, you'd find Korea not as a fractured battlefield, but as a place of rhythm, order, and deep continuity. Long before the Japanese Empire cast its shadow, before Soviets and Americans drew hurried lines on a map, the peninsula carried its own sense of pride and permanence. It wasn't a blank canvas waiting for outsiders to shape it. It was already painted in careful strokes of dynasties, traditions, and stories that bound generations together. Think of the Joseon dynasty, which reigned from the late 14th century all the way into the dawn of the 20th. That's over 500 years of single dynasty, a stretch of stability that outlasted most European monarchies of the same era. When families lived under the same ruling house for that long, the dynasty became more than a political institution. It became part of the cultural weather, the expected sky overhead. People were born, worked, loved, and died with Joseon as the backdrop, as if the dynasty itself was another relative at the table. Confucianism shaped that long era like a steady drumbeat. In Joseon Korea, it wasn't just philosophy, it was the architecture of daily life. It governed how families bowed to elders, how officials sat in courts, how scholars prepared for the civil service exams that determined prestige. There is a sense of balance and hierarchy, of everyone knowing their place in a latticework of respect and responsibility. Homes were arranged with courtyards and gates reflecting that order, so the physical world echoed the moral one. Education mattered profoundly. To write in Hangul, the uniquely Korean alphabet created in the 15th century under King Sejong, was to carry national pride in the strokes of your brush. While Chinese characters dominated official records, Hangul quietly spread among common folk, especially women, who used it to record poems, letters, and stories. It became the intimate voice of the people, proof that Korea had its own way of expressing thought, independent of outside powers. Even when elites sneered at it, Hangul endured, carrying lullabies, folk tales, and prayers through centuries. Religion and spirituality interwove with these traditions. Confucian rites honored ancestors, while Buddhism lingered in temples carved into mountainsides, offering incense to stone Buddhas weathered by rain. Shamanistic practices persisted in villages, with madong, shamans, often women, calling on spirits to heal illness or bless harvests. It wasn't contradiction but coexistence. The court might debate philosophy, while a farmer whispered to mountain gods before planting rice. And then there was art. Delicate white porcelain vases, serene ink paintings of pine trees, folk songs sung in fields. All of it reinforced a sense of continuity. A Korean identity wasn't something abstract. It was tactile, baked into ceramics, carved into wooden doors, sung at weddings. The peninsula's culture was its fortress, a way of saying, we exist, we endure. Of course, dynasties weren't all harmony. Politics could be brutal, factions bitter, and peasant uprisings real. But through it all, the larger rhythm of Confucian order and cultural pride kept society from unraveling. For ordinary people, it meant that even if rulers squabbled, family bonds, village traditions, and respect for the past gave life a steady anchor. That sense of identity, rooted, stubborn, dignified, would later carry Koreans through decades of foreign rule. By the time the 19th century arrived, Korea already had centuries of resilience woven into its bones. You might say the peninsula had muscle memory for survival, trained by dynasties, rituals, and language. That memory would soon be tested as storms gathered beyond its shores. Geography is destiny, or so the saying goes. For Korea, destiny meant living in a neighborhood where every neighbor was bigger, hungrier, and often intrusive. To the west lay China, long the dominant power of East Asia, a cultural elder brother and political overlord. To the north stretched the vastness of Russia, whose empire was always looking for warm water ports and southern footholds. And to the east, across the sea, Japan, which began as a sometimes friendly trading partner but grew into an ambitious power with eyes on the continent. Imagine a small house wedged between three mansions, each with a history of barging in uninvited. Korea learned early on how to survive by balancing these forces, sending tribute missions to China to keep peace, cautiously managing trade with Japan, and eyeing Russian expansion warily. Diplomacy became an art of endurance, less about bold moves and more about quiet survival. China's influence was deep. For centuries, Korea was part of the Sino-centric tributary system, acknowledging the Chinese emperor as superior in return for peace and recognition. But this wasn't subjugation so much as pragmatic diplomacy. Korea absorbed Confucian thought, Chinese bureaucratic models, and classical characters, yet preserved its own tongue, rituals, and monarchs. It was a relationship of borrowing without erasure, respect without surrender. Russia entered Korea's horizon in the 19th century. The empire's march across Siberia and its appetite for the Pacific made Korea a tempting southern extension. Russian diplomats and traders appeared, raising alarms in both Beijing and Tokyo. For Korea, Russia was both potential protector and looming threat, a reminder that the northern frontier was never truly quiet. Japan, meanwhile, transformed from a relatively closed island nation into a modernizing power after the Meiji Restoration of 1868. With modernization came ambition, and with ambition came the urge to secure resources and influence. Korea, just across the strait, looked like both a natural partner and a vulnerable target. Trade, treaties, and then pressure, Japan's footsteps grew heavier with each passing decade. The problem was simple but brutal. Korea's location made it too strategic to be ignored. It was a gateway to China, a buffer against Russia, and a resource-rich peninsula in its own right. For empires playing chess, Korea was never just Korea. It was a square on the board that could tip the balance of power in East Asia. For ordinary Koreans, geography translated into uncertainty. Foreign envoys appeared in ports, soldiers marched through passes, and kings debated policies that had less to do with local needs and more to do with keeping giants at bay. It was like living in a quiet village that happened to sit on a crossroads where armies kept passing. You tended your fields, but you always kept an ear out for the thunder of hooves. This precarious geography meant Korea had to be resilient in ways that went beyond armies. Its people learned how to bend without breaking, how to preserve identity while nodding to stronger neighbors. Geography demanded compromise, but also reinforced pride. Survival in such a tough neighborhood was itself proof of strength. Yet as the 19th century drew on, the old balancing act began to fail. China weakened under Western pressure, Russia pressed closer, and Japan surged with modern power. The small house between mansions was about to be stormed. The 19th century was cruel to small nations. It was the age of steamships, rifles, and telegraph wires, the tools of empires that stretched their arms across seas and continents. Korea, for centuries, had maintained a delicate balance, a cautious independence under China's umbrella, but the umbrella was collapsing. Western gunboats prowled Asian waters, and Japan, freshly awakened from its slumber, was hungry for a seat at the imperial table. The peninsula felt the squeeze. Treaties began to appear, unequal treaties, as Koreans rightly called them, forced by foreign diplomats who arrived with warships as punctuation. The Treaty of Ganghwa in 1876, signed after a Japanese gunboat incident, pried open Korean ports under the pretense of friendship. But everyone knew what it meant. Japan intended to treat Korea the way Western powers treated China, as a prize to be carved and exploited. Meanwhile, Western nations hovered like vultures over a weakening China, and by extension, over Korea. American missionaries arrived, bringing Christianity, medicine, and schools, which offered both education and subtle pressure to modernize. French priests continued their quiet work in the countryside, sometimes clashing with local officials. British traders eyed harbors. Each new foreign presence chipped away at Korea's ability to chart its own course. Internally, the kingdom strained under the weight of these pressures. The old Confucian order, once a source of stability, now seemed rigid, even paralyzing. Court factions bickered between isolationists and reformers, between those who clung to the tributary system with China and those who argued that Korea must modernize quickly to survive. Peasant unrest simmered as taxes rose and corrupt officials lined their pockets. In the 1890s, the Donghak peasant revolution swept across the countryside, demanding land reform and an end to foreign influence. Ordinary farmers, armed with bamboo spears and raw determination, briefly threatened to topple the system itself. But Korea's struggle wasn't just internal. It was entangled with the ambitions of giants. Japan and China clashed in the First Sino-Japanese War, 1894 to 1895, fought largely over control of Korea. When Japan won, it was a humiliation for China and a death knell for Korea's traditional reliance on Chinese protection. Almost overnight, Japan's shadow lengthened across the peninsula. Korea was now less a tributary state than a contested prize. The Korean court attempted reforms, establishing a short-lived independence in the form of the Korean Empire in 1897 under King Gojong, who crowned himself emperor to signal parity with China and Japan. He tried to modernize, building railroads, reorganizing the army, and sending students abroad. But these moves, while bold, were too little, too late. With foreign advisors whispering in the palace and rival powers circling, every reform was compromised, every law contested. The assassination of Queen Min, Empress Myeongseong, in 1895 by Japanese agents marked a turning point. She had resisted Japanese dominance and sought Russian protection. For that, she was brutally murdered in her own palace. The act shocked Koreans, outraged international observers, and made plain what was at stake: sovereignty itself. By the dawn of the 20th century, Korea stood at the center of a storm. The Russo-Japanese War, 1904 to 1905, again turned Korea into a battlefield in everything but name. Japan's victory over Russia stunned the world and made clear who now controlled the peninsula. Treaties signed under duress. First a protectorate agreement in 1905, then outright annexation in 1910 sealed Korea's fate. Independence had slipped away, and occupation loomed. Koreans, though, did not surrender their identity quietly. The late 19th century may have been a story of decline on paper, but it was also a story of stubborn survival in spirit. Families still taught Hangul at home. Farmers still prayed at ancestral graves. Students still whispered about a Korea that was more than a pawn on someone else's board. The empire might collapse, but the nation, as an idea, endured. When Japan formally annexed Korea in 1910, it marked the beginning of one of the harshest colonial regimes in Asia. This wasn't simply conquest, it was assimilation by force, an attempt to erase Korean identity and replace it with Japanese authority. Schools became the first battleground. Japanese authorities restructured education so that Korean children were taught Japanese language and history as superior. Hangul, the alphabet Koreans cherished, was banned from classrooms, relegated to private use. Textbooks extolled the emperor in Tokyo, not the ancestors of Korea. For children, it meant learning to write essays praising a ruler they had never seen and to salute a flag that wasn't their own. Public spaces reflected the new order. Signboards switched from Korean script to Japanese. Temples and shrines were rededicated to Japan's Shinto practices, and Koreans were pressured to attend rituals alien to their traditions. Even names became contested ground. By the 1930s, colonial authorities demanded Koreans adopt Japanese-style surnames, severing the symbolic tie to family lineage that Confucian society held sacred. Economically, Korea became a resource colony. Rice, timber, and minerals were extracted to fuel Japan's growing empire. Infrastructure like railroads and ports expanded, but not for Korean benefit. They were built to ship resources outward and troops inward. Industrialization touched the peninsula unevenly, often leaving Koreans as cheap laborers in their own land. Yet, perhaps the cruelest cut was psychological. The colonial project wasn't just about governing Korea, but about convincing Koreans that their culture was inferior, their identity a relic. Propaganda campaigns insisted Korea had always been subordinate to Japan, twisting history to justify domination. The message was clear: to be modern, to succeed, to survive, Koreans must abandon their roots and become Japanese in all but blood. But beneath the surface compliance, resistance simmered. Parents still whispered Hangul at home, teaching children to write in secret notebooks. Folk songs carried hidden defiance. Christian churches became sanctuaries for Korean language preaching and national memory. Shaman rituals, once dismissed as superstition, now became acts of quiet resistance, ways of keeping something unbroken. The March 1st movement of 1919 revealed how deeply the flame still burned. On that day, activists read a Declaration of Independence in Seoul, sparking demonstrations across the peninsula. For weeks, students, workers, and farmers flooded streets waving Korean flags, chanting for freedom. Japanese police and soldiers cracked down with ruthless force, killing thousands, jailing many more. Yet the protests spread, carried by rumor and conviction. The world took notice, if only briefly, that Korea was not silent. The annexation years hardened Korea. They took away the visible symbols of sovereignty, but left behind a steely determination. Every confiscated book, every renamed street, every silenced voice added to a collective memory that said, "We are still here, even if you cannot see us." Suppression at home didn't end the story. It only pushed it outward. If you wanted to understand Korea in the 1910s, 20s, and 30s, you had to look beyond its borders into exile communities scattered like seeds across Asia. Resistance didn't disappear, it traveled. Manchuria, just over the northern border, became a kind of open-air refuge. Its rugged mountains and sparse settlements offered cover for Korean fighters who fled Japanese crackdowns. These guerrilla bands weren't well equipped, but they were fueled by memory and rage. Armed with outdated rifles or even hunting weapons, they staged hit-and-run attacks on Japanese garrisons, sabotaged railways, and melted back into the hills. The Japanese authorities labeled them bandits. Koreans called them patriots. Shanghai, too, became a hub. There, in 1919, exiled leaders declared the Provisional Government of the Republic of Korea. It was fragile, often underfunded and splintered by ideological disputes, but it provided a voice for independence on the international stage. Figures like Syngman re-lobbied abroad, while others plotted resistance strategies. The government in exile never held power inside Korea, but it kept alive the idea of sovereignty when the world tried to forget. China's cities, Beijing, Nanjing, and beyond, hosted waves of Korean students and intellectuals who blended nationalist dreams with new ideologies. Some leaned toward Christianity and Western democracy, others toward socialism and communism, influenced by the upheavals in Russia and China. They argued, they split, they reformed, but always with one refrain: Korea must be free. The diaspora extended farther still. Koreans in Hawaii, Siberia, and the United States raised money, organized rallies, and petitioned governments. Independence newspapers circulated secretly back into Korea, smuggled across borders by couriers who risked arrest. Resistance was no longer just a local matter. It became transnational, a network woven across continents. By the 1930s, as Japan deepened its control and launched its invasion of China, resistance grew more militarized. Korean fighters in Manchuria often coordinated with Chinese partisans, sharing trenches and food. Among them was a young guerrilla named Kim Il-sung, whose exploits, though sometimes mythologized later, symbolized a new generation of fighters. To those in the hills, every ambush was proof that Korea's spirit hadn't been erased. The Japanese, frustrated by the persistence of these movements, launched brutal pacification campaigns in Manchuria, burning villages suspected of aiding guerrillas, deporting families, and flooding the region with troops. Yet the resistance endured, like a stubborn ember refusing to die out. In truth, exile movements often quarreled, fractured by ideology, distance, and scarce resources. But taken together, they served as a bridge. They kept the dream of independence alive across decades of darkness. The fighters in Manchuria, the politicians in Shanghai, the students in Tokyo daring to organize under the occupier's nose, they were all threads of the same fabric. A Korea without land, but not without identity. What does it feel like when a nation is occupied for a generation? Not just conquered in war, but steadily reshaped, told every day that it should not exist? The answer isn't written in treaties, it's etched into daily life. For many Koreans, the occupation was a kind of slow suffocation. Every school lesson that erased Hangul, every newspaper censored, Every shrine visit forced by authorities was another turn of the screw. Identity itself felt like contraband. Parents whispered Korean words at home, fearful that children might repeat them in school and bring punishment. Families kept family genealogies hidden, afraid they might be confiscated during the name change campaigns. And yet, people carried on. Farmers still planted rice. Merchants still haggled in markets. Weddings were held, babies born, funerals attended. Life didn't stop. It adapted, reshaping itself around pressure. But beneath the surface, there was a gnawing wound. The humiliation of being ruled by others, of seeing your flag lowered, your voice diminished. For older generations, it was grief mixed with stubbornness. They had known a Korea that was independent, however fragile, and they refused to believe their grandchildren would never see it again. For the young, born under the Japanese flag, it was confusion. Were they Korean, as their parents insisted, or Japanese, as their teachers demanded? The struggle wasn't just political, it was psychological, a tug of war inside the soul. Some coped by assimilating, seeking opportunity in the colonial system, working for Japanese firms, serving in the military, even emigrating to Japan itself. Others resisted quietly, refusing to speak Japanese at home, preserving traditions, saving stories. Many simply endured, hoping the storm would pass. The emotional toll showed in small gestures, a bowed head when soldiers marched by, a silence when foreign anthems played. Dignity felt like something fragile, hidden away like a family heirloom too precious to display. Yet it remained. No occupier, however thorough, could fully erase the pride embedded in language, ritual, and memory. When Japan entered World War II and mobilized Korea further, conscripting young men, forcing women into military brothels as comfort women, extracting resources at full tilt, the toll deepened. Families were broken apart. Communities hollowed out. The weight of survival pressed heavier than ever. But even then, beneath the pain, the stubborn truth endured. Korea was not Japan. By 1945, after 35 years of occupation, the peninsula was scarred but unbroken. Dignity had been battered, eroded by daily indignities and traumas, but not erased. Like water carving stone, the occupation reshaped Korea, but at its core, something immovable remained. And when liberation came, suddenly, with Japan's defeat in World War II, the release was electric. Crowds filled the streets, waving Korean flags long hidden away. Old songs were sung in public again. Tears flowed freely. But beneath the celebration was also the echo of long sorrow, a knowledge that dignity reclaimed does not erase the pain of dignity denied. So the stage was set. A people rooted in centuries of tradition, squeezed by geography, battered by empires, suppressed by occupation, yet still holding onto an identity that refused to vanish. Korea entered the mid-20th century not as a blank slate, but as a wounded nation with deep scars and deeper pride. When the Japanese empire finally collapsed, it seemed the storm had ended. But in truth, it was only the beginning of a new struggle, one that would pull the peninsula apart, set brothers against brothers, and draw the world's superpowers into its mountains and fields. The shadows of history had already lengthened, and in those shadows, the outlines of war were waiting. When the news finally came, it felt unreal. After 35 years under the heavy hand of Japanese rule, Koreans awoke in August 1945 to rumors that the empire had surrendered. Whispers passed in alleys, in markets, in schools that had been shuttered by war. By mid-August, the whispers became shouts, and then a roar. Flags that had been hidden in attics and rice jars were pulled out, stitched together from scraps, waved openly in the streets. The tricolor taegukgi, banned for decades, now fluttered like a reclaimed heartbeat. In Seoul, crowds surged through Jongno, tearing down Japanese signs, singing songs that had been forbidden for a generation. People climbed atop streetcars, waving banners and chanting mants. Long live Korea! The cry that had once been dangerous to whisper was now shouted until throats went hoarse. Children born under occupation tasted independence for the first time, though they couldn't yet grasp its weight. Rural villages echoed with their own celebrations. Farmers lit bonfires, temples rang bells, churches held Thanksgiving services. Some people simply wept, unable to put into words what it meant to see an empire's grip finally broken. It wasn't only political, it was personal. A name no longer forced into Japanese syllables. A song no longer sung in secret. A memory no longer buried. But beneath the euphoria, unease stirred. Liberation had arrived, not from a homegrown uprising or a negotiated peace, but from the sudden collapse of Japan under Allied bombs. Hiroshima and Nagasaki had burned in nuclear fire. The Soviet Union had stormed Manchuria, and Tokyo had finally bowed. Korea, long a colony, was suddenly free, yet the Koreans themselves had not been invited to the table where the future was being decided. The joy in the streets was pure, but fleeting. Within days, foreign soldiers appeared. First Soviets in the north, Americans in the south, each claiming to help, each bringing their own banners and orders. Liberation, yes. But peace? That was already slipping through the cracks. The Soviet Union moved fast. On August 8, 1945, it declared war on Japan, launching a massive offensive into Manchuria. Red Army tanks rolled with astonishing speed, crushing Japanese forces and spilling into northern Korea. By the time the surrender was signed, Soviet troops controlled everything above the 38th parallel. For villagers in the north, the sight of Soviet soldiers was both bewildering and oddly relieving. Unlike the Japanese, they didn't arrive to colonize. They came as liberators, or so they said. Soldiers handed out food, treated locals with a kind of rough camaraderie, and dismantled Japanese military posts. In Pyongyang, the Red Army was welcomed with cheers, if also with suspicion. Koreans had little experience with Soviets, but after decades of Japanese brutality, even a foreign power in new uniforms felt like a reprieve. In the South, it was Americans who arrived, weeks later, landing in Incheon and marching into Seoul in early September. U.S. Officers were greeted by jubilant crowds, young people draped in flags, church choirs singing hymns of gratitude. For many, America seemed like a savior, a distant nation that had helped topple the empire that ruled them for so long. But soon the contrasts emerged. Soviet and American forces did not coordinate with Koreans about governance. They coordinated with each other and mostly with their own governments thousands of miles away. Both treated Korea not as a nation ready for independence, but as a strategic chessboard in a larger game. One side leaned socialist, the other capitalist. One spoke of workers' revolutions, the other of free markets and anti-communism. Neither side asked Koreans what they wanted. So the peninsula, long unified by history, culture, and language, found itself suddenly split. Not by choice, but by circumstance, by the arrival of two great powers who barely understood it. The liberators carried maps, but not memories. They saw zones, not villages. For all the foreign boots now on Korean soil, something deeply personal blossomed in those first months after liberation: the return of identity. The Japanese had tried to suffocate Korean culture, but with their empire gone, the old sounds, words, and symbols burst back to life. Schools reopened with Korean lessons. Teachers who had once been forced to use Japanese textbooks now dusted off Hangul primers, rediscovering the alphabet as if it were both ancient and brand new. Children wrote their names proudly in Korean, parents hung calligraphy scrolls in their homes, and printers scrambled to produce newspapers in Hangul once more. What had been whispered became shouted, scribbled, printed, and sung. Temples and churches rededicated themselves to Korean traditions. Hymns and chants once forbidden now filled sanctuaries. Markets resounded with Korean songs and folk tales. Even street signs were quickly repainted, Japanese kanji scraped off and replaced with Hangul. It was more than cosmetic. It was catharsis, the restoration of dignity. Flags were everywhere. Families who had risked arrest for hiding the taeguki now waved it from rooftops. Seamstresses stitched them hurriedly from bedsheets. In some places, children marched in parades, carrying flags taller than themselves, symbols larger than their bodies could hold. But symbols, though powerful, could not erase the practical reality. Korea had no functioning national government, no army of its own, and no seat at the table in international negotiations. Identity had returned in spirit, but sovereignty, real, tangible sovereignty, was still out of reach. It didn't take long for the joy of liberation to sour into confusion. Koreans, imagining freedom, instead found themselves under new administrations. The Soviets in the North installed committees of local communists, many of them guerrilla fighters who had spent years in Manchuria. They spoke the language of revolution, promising land reform, equality, and a break from old hierarchies. To peasants who had suffered under landlords, this sounded like hope. To landowners and traditional elites, it sounded like theft. In the South, the Americans struggled from the start. Few U.S. officers spoke Korean. They didn't understand the factions and histories that shaped local politics. They relied heavily on former Japanese administrators and conservative Korean elites to maintain order, an irony not lost on those who had fought occupation. American General John Hodge admitted privately he knew little of Korea when he landed, yet he was tasked with governing millions. Korean activists who had long dreamed of independence, nationalists, socialists, Christians, students, suddenly found themselves sidelined. They petitioned, protested, organized mass rallies demanding immediate sovereignty, but the foreign armies brushed them aside. Washington and Moscow insisted Korea wasn't ready for self-rule. They would prepare it under trusteeship, like a ward waiting for guardians to decide its future. The disappointment was palpable. Liberation had been expected to mean self-government, but instead it felt like a new occupation, friendlier in rhetoric perhaps, but still foreign boots on Korean soil, still decisions made in distant capitals. The division, at first, seemed almost accidental. In late August 1945, as Japan's surrender terms were finalized, two American officers in Washington, Dean Rusk and Charles Bonesteel, were tasked with proposing a line to divide Soviet and American zones of control in Korea. Pressed for time, they consulted a National Geographic map and chose the 38th parallel, thinking it a fair compromise. It placed Seoul in the U.S. zone while giving the Soviets access to Pyongyang. They expected the Soviets might reject it. Instead, Moscow accepted. On paper, the division was supposed to be temporary. The Allies would oversee the withdrawal of Japanese forces, help Korea establish a unified government, and then depart. In practice, the line hardened quickly. Soviet troops dug in north of the 38th, U.S. troops in the south. Crossing the line became difficult, then impossible. Families split overnight. Farmers who worked fields across the border suddenly found themselves cut off from their own land. Merchants lost customers. Travelers were stranded. To Koreans, the division felt artificial, imposed without consultation. The peninsula had never in its history been divided this way. Villages that had traded for centuries suddenly found themselves separated by barbed wire. The word temporary rang hollow as weeks turned to months and months to years. Even in the first months after liberation, mistrust began to grow. In the North, Soviet-backed committees empowered communists and landless peasants, reshaping society in radical ways. Old landlords were stripped of their holdings, Japanese collaborators purged, industry reorganized under central control. To many poor Koreans, it felt like justice. To others, it looked like chaos. In the South, American authorities leaned toward preserving stability. They reinstated landlords, kept much of the colonial police force intact, and suppressed left-leaning groups they feared were communist. Worker strikes were broken up, peasant uprisings crushed. For Koreans who had hoped liberation would bring social reform, it felt like betrayal. Within a single year of freedom, two different Koreas were already taking shape, one revolutionary, one conservative. Both claimed to speak for the nation, and both eyed the other with suspicion. Ordinary people were caught in the middle, unsure which vision would prevail, fearful that unity, the very thing liberation had promised, was already slipping away. Liberation came like a thunderclap, sudden and overwhelming, but did not bring the peace Koreans had dreamed of. Instead, the peninsula became a stage for new actors, each carrying their own scripts, each seeing Korea not as an independent nation, but as a square on a global chessboard. The people, who had endured occupation with patience and pride, found themselves once again waiting, this time for their own voice to be heard. Joy had turned into uncertainty, unity into division, hope into mistrust. The war had ended, but the peace never quite began. It happened in a room in Washington, not on the peninsula itself. August 1945, the war in the Pacific was collapsing, Japan was surrendering, and the question fell onto someone's desk: how to handle Korea. Few in Washington had thought deeply about the peninsula. Strategists had obsessed over Japan, China, the Philippines, but Korea? It had been an afterthought, long overshadowed by Japan's occupation. Now, suddenly, it was a problem demanding immediate answers. Two relatively junior American officers, Dean Rusk and Charles Bonesteel, were given the task of drawing up a proposal. They had little time, mere hours, and little guidance beyond the need to prevent the entire peninsula from falling under Soviet control. They opened a National Geographic map, pointed at the 38th parallel, and decided it looked like a neat, simple compromise. The line placed Seoul, Korea's capital, under American control while conceding northern areas to the Soviets. It was a cartographer's convenience, not a cultural or political boundary. When the proposal was presented, even American leaders were uncertain if the Soviets would accept. To their surprise, Moscow agreed swiftly, perhaps because they were already satisfied with their gains in Manchuria and northern Korea. And so, without a single Korean voice consulted, the peninsula was split in two by foreign hands thousands of miles away. On paper, the division was administrative, temporary. The Allies would occupy their respective zones until a unified Korean government could be established. In reality, the line quickly hardened into something more. What had been a pencil mark across a map would soon become a scar across a nation. The Soviets wasted no time consolidating control in the north. They set up local people's committees, often staffed by Koreans who had fought as guerrillas in Manchuria or who had lived in exile in the Soviet Union. These committees promised land reform, worker empowerment, and a break from old hierarchies. Factories seized from Japanese owners were placed under collective management. Land was redistributed from landlords to peasants. To many impoverished Koreans, it felt like long-awaited justice. At the center of this transformation was Kim Il-sung, a young guerrilla commander with Soviet backing. The Red Army promoted him as the face of a new Korea, charismatic, nationalist in tone, yet loyal to Moscow's vision of socialism. His rise was carefully stage-managed, but to many Koreans he appeared as a fresh alternative to the old elites. In the South, the Americans faced a more complicated situation. They arrived later, less prepared, and with little understanding of Korean politics. General John Hodge, tasked with administering the Southern Zone, admitted privately that he knew almost nothing about Korea. His immediate concern was maintaining order, not fostering self-rule. To that end, the U.S. relied heavily on existing structures, many of them tainted by collaboration with Japan. Colonial police officers, bureaucrats, and landlords were kept in place, rebranded now as partners of the Americans. To Koreans who had suffered under these same men, it felt like betrayal. The very people who had enforced Japanese rule were once again in uniform, this time under a different flag. The Americans also elevated Syngman Rhee, a staunchly anti-communist Korean exile who had spent decades in the United States. Though many Koreans were skeptical of him, Rhee was Washington's man, a figure they believed could hold the South together under a pro-Western banner. His authoritarian tendencies were overlooked in favor of his reliability as an anti-communist. Thus, within months of liberation, two rival administrations had taken root. One Soviet-backed in the North, one American-backed in the South. Both claimed legitimacy. Both distrusted the other. And both were beginning to act as if the division was permanent. For ordinary Koreans, the 38th parallel wasn't a line on a map. It was a wound in daily life. Families who had lived together for generations suddenly found themselves separated. A farmer with fields that crossed the line could no longer tend them. Traders who had travel routes between Pyongyang and Seoul for decades were stopped at checkpoints. Letters were censored, travel restricted, crossings denied. The division was particularly cruel because it cut through regions with no natural boundaries. Rivers, mountains, and roads all ignored the parallel, making the border feel arbitrary and unnatural. A cousin might live a few miles north of the line, yet might as well have been across an ocean once movement was restricted. Weddings were missed, funerals unattended, families fractured not by choice, but by geopolitical calculation. Culture, too, began to fray. Northern newspapers carried socialist rhetoric, praising land reform and the working class. Southern papers focused on anti-communism and national unity under American guidance. Radio broadcasts diverged, schools taught different curricula, political rallies carried different slogans. A people who had shared centuries of common culture were now fed competing visions of their future. The psychological toll was immense. For a nation that had endured colonization precisely because it valued continuity and identity, to be suddenly told it was now two nations, two governments, two armies, two futures, was bewildering. Many clung desperately to the hope that the division was temporary, that reunification was inevitable once foreign troops withdrew. But as months passed, hope began to thin. Borders carry power when they're enforced by soldiers, and the 38th parallel was soon bristling with them. Soviet troops guarded the northern side. American troops patrolled the southern. Checkpoints sprouted, barbed wire stretched across fields, and villagers were questioned about their loyalties. For Koreans who had never known such a border, it felt surreal. The peninsula had been invaded, yes, occupied, yes, but never formally split. The mountains and rivers had always been shared, the dynasties and empires ruling over one Korea, not two. The very idea of dividing the nation contradicted centuries of history. Yet here it was, soldiers with foreign accents enforcing an artificial line drawn on a map far away. Tensions soon followed. Armed skirmishes erupted between local militias and rival factions near the border. Refugees tried to slip across, often at night, risking arrest or worse. Rumors circulated of spies and infiltrators. The parallel, once a bureaucratic fiction, was becoming a lived reality, enforced with rifles and checkpoints. The cruelty was not only in separation, but in suspicion. A man from the north visiting relatives in the south might be treated as a potential communist. A southerner in the north might be branded a capitalist sympathizer. Trust, the glue of community, began to dissolve under the pressure of enforced division. Perhaps the bitterest truth of 1945 was this: liberation had not returned sovereignty. For all the flags waved, songs sung, and cheers shouted, Koreans quickly realized they were not the ones deciding their nation's future. The division at the 38th parallel had been made without their input. The Soviets and Americans coordinated with each other, not with Koreans. The provisional government in exile, established in Shanghai during the colonial years, was dismissed by Washington as unrepresentative. Local committees, hastily formed by Koreans themselves, were ignored or disbanded by the occupiers. Ordinary people felt a growing sense of betrayal. They had endured decades of occupation with the dream of independence, only to find themselves pawns in a larger Cold War struggle. Protests erupted. Mass rallies demanded immediate unification and sovereignty, but the foreign armies were unmoved. The Allies spoke of preparing Korea for self-rule, but in practice they were entrenching their own spheres of influence. The realization was painful, but it planted seeds of determination. If liberation had not brought freedom, then freedom would have to be fought for again, this time not against one empire, but against the designs of two superpowers. It wasn't for lack of trying. In the late 1940s, Koreans from both zones proposed joint committees, provisional governments, and all-Korean elections. Conferences were held in Seoul, Pyongyang, and even abroad, bringing together nationalists, communists, Christians, and intellectuals who still believed unity was possible. But every attempt collapsed under the weight of foreign interference and mutual suspicion. The Soviets insisted on including only groups friendly to socialism. The Americans excluded leftists they deemed too radical. Each side accused the other of manipulation. Promises of free, peninsula-wide elections evaporated into stalemates and recriminations. By 1947, it was clear that the temporary division was hardening. The United Nations proposed elections, but the North refused to participate, denouncing it as an American plot. The South held its own elections in 1948, installing Syngman Rhee as president of the Republic of Korea. The North responded by declaring the Democratic People's Republic of Korea under Kim Il-sung. Two governments, two capitals, two armies, two Koreas. The dream of unification had not died in people's hearts, but it had been strangled in politics. What was once temporary was now official, and the peninsula stood on the brink of deeper conflict. The line drawn in haste across a map had become a reality on the ground. Families divided, cultures split, rival governments installed. What began as an administrative convenience had evolved into a geopolitical fracture. For Koreans, the heartbreak was not only in being divided, but in being divided without consent. The land of dynasties and traditions, of centuries of unity, was now forced into two hostile camps. The wound was fresh, but it would soon be torn wider. The next chapter of Korea's story would not be about negotiation or compromise. It would be about war. If ever there was a man shaped by exile, it was Syngman Rhee. Born in 1875, during the waning days of the Joseon dynasty, he grew up in a Korea trying to balance tradition with modern pressures. Bright and ambitious, he was drawn to education and Christianity, both of which would shape his politics and his destiny. Imprisoned as a young man for participating in reformist movements, he learned early that power in Korea often meant suppression. Released, he traveled abroad, eventually finding his way to the United States, where he spent decades. He studied at George Washington University, Harvard, and even Princeton, earning advanced degrees at a time when few Koreans had such opportunities. While many of his peers lived lives of subsistence farming, Rhee immersed himself in Western ideas of democracy and governance. Yet he was no idealist in the pure sense. He admired American democracy, yes, but he also learned how power worked in Washington, how influence and lobbying mattered more than abstract principle. He became adept at cultivating contacts, writing letters, maneuvering himself into circles of influence. When Korea was liberated in 1945, Rhee returned as a man in his 70s, hardened by years abroad. He was fiercely anti-communist, so much so that it defined his politics. To him, communism wasn't just another ideology. It was the very antithesis of the independence and freedom he longed for. His time in the U.S. had cemented this worldview, aligning him closely with American officials who were searching for reliable allies in Asia as the Cold War intensified. Rhee's vision for Korea was uncompromising. He wanted a unified nation under his leadership, free from communism, anchored in strong central authority. He had little patience for rivals, whether left-wing nationalists or even fellow conservatives who questioned his approach. Democracy was a word he used, but in practice, his politics leaned authoritarian. He believed Korea needed a firm hand to survive its tumultuous birth. In 1948, with American backing, he became the first president of the Republic of Korea. His speeches dripped with fiery rhetoric against communism, casting the northern regime as illegitimate puppets of Moscow. He presented himself as Korea's savior, the only leader strong enough to resist both communism and the lingering influence of Japanese collaborators. But his rule came with contradictions. He tolerated little dissent, using police and security forces to crush uprisings, sometimes brutally. The Jeju Uprising of 1948-49, in which leftist rebels rose against his government, was suppressed with shocking violence, leaving tens of thousands dead. For Rhee, it was necessary, a bloody proof of his determination to eliminate communism at any cost. For ordinary Koreans, it raised fears that liberation had simply traded one form of repression for another. Still, Rhee's political survival instincts were unmatched. He wrapped himself in the language of nationalism and democracy, even as he consolidated power in his own hands. To the Americans, he was a difficult but indispensable ally. To his supporters, he was a patriot who would never yield to communism. To his critics, he was an autocrat in waiting. North of the parallel, another leader was rising, one younger, hungrier, and with a very different story. Kim Il-sung was born in 1912, just as Korea fell under Japanese rule. His childhood was marked by exile. His family fled to Manchuria, where he grew up amid Chinese and Korean resistance movements. By his teens, he had joined guerrilla bands fighting Japanese forces in the rugged borderlands. Kim's early life was forged in hardship and battle. He lived in camps, marched through mountains, ambushed enemy patrols, and endured freezing winters with little more than grit to keep him alive. To the Japanese, he was a nuisance, one of many guerrilla leaders. To his followers, he was a symbol of defiance, a young commander who embodied resistance. In the 1930s, as Japan intensified its hold on Manchuria, Kim's band of fighters dwindled under relentless pressure. Many were killed, captured, or scattered. Kim himself fled into the Soviet Union, where he found sanctuary and new patrons. The Red Army recognized his potential and gave him military training. He adopted the ways of a Soviet officer, complete with uniform and discipline, while keeping alive his reputation as a guerrilla hero. When the Soviets occupied northern Korea in 1945, they needed a Korean leader who could rally the people while remaining loyal to Moscow. Kim Il-sung was the perfect candidate. He was relatively young, just in his early 30s, but his credentials as a resistance fighter gave him legitimacy. His years in the Soviet Union meant he spoke Russian and could work easily with Soviet officers. The Soviets presented him carefully, almost like unveiling a chosen figure. In Pyongyang, mass rallies introduced Kim as the face of a new Korea, a man who had fought for liberation while others had compromised or collaborated. His image was burnished with propaganda, but it resonated. Koreans longed for heroes, and Kim seemed to fit the role. His politics were rooted in socialism, but more importantly in nationalism. He spoke of building a strong, independent Korea, free from Japanese exploitation and Western interference. Land reform was his first major act, redistributing property from landlords to peasants. It was wildly popular among the poor, though bitterly resented by elites. Kim, like Ri, tolerated little opposition. Rivals were pushed aside, sometimes exiled, sometimes worse. Opposition parties were allowed briefly, but only under the dominance of the Workers' Party, which Kim controlled. By 1948, when the Democratic People's Republic of Korea was proclaimed in Pyongyang, Kim stood firmly at its helm. Unlike Ri, Kim cultivated a cult of personality from the start. Portraits of him appeared in homes and schools, his speeches broadcast widely, his guerrilla exploits celebrated in song and story. The Soviets had elevated him, but he was determined to root his legitimacy in Korean soil. Here was the crux of the tragedy. Both Syngman Rhee in the south and Kim Il-sung in the north claimed to be the only true leader of a unified Korea. Neither accepted division as permanent. Both vowed to reunify the peninsula, under their own system, their own authority. Rhee thundered about driving communists into the sea. Kim spoke of liberating Southern Koreans from American imperialism. Their speeches mirrored each other in intensity, each casting the other as traitor and puppet. To the south, Kim was a Soviet stooge. To the north, Rhee was an American lackey. Neither could accept the other's existence without threatening their own legitimacy. This wasn't just rhetoric. Both sides began preparing for war, building armies, stockpiling weapons, training young men for the inevitable clash. Each border skirmish, each propaganda campaign, was a rehearsal for a larger conflict to come. If you listened to the radio in Seoul in 1948, you'd hear Rhee's government warning of communist subversion, describing Kim as a pawn of Moscow who enslaved peasants. If you tuned in from Pyongyang, you'd hear Kim's government denounce Rhee as a traitor who sold Korea's sovereignty to Wall Street and Washington. Propaganda was relentless. Posters showed caricatures of the enemy. Rhee as a cruel dictator, Kim as a dangerous Bolshevik. Newspapers demonized the other side. Schools taught children that reunification would come, but only by destroying the illegitimate regime across the border. The propaganda worked. Suspicion deepened, hatred hardened, and compromise became nearly impossible. When you're taught the arrival is not merely mistaken but treacherous, the space for dialogue shrinks to nothing. Neither leader tolerated dissent. In the north, Kim Il-sung systematically eliminated rivals within the communist movement. Men who had fought alongside him in Manchuria, or who had returned from exile in China and the Soviet Union. Some were exiled, others imprisoned, a few executed. Loyalty to Kim became the only measure of survival. In the South, Syngman Rhee cracked down on leftists, union organizers, and student activists. His police and military hunted suspected communists with zeal, often arresting thousands on little evidence. Some were imprisoned, others executed, many simply disappeared. For Rhee, It was not just about silencing opponents. It was about demonstrating to Washington that he was a reliable anti-communist bulwark. By the late 1940s, both Koreas had become authoritarian states in practice, even as they claimed to represent the will of the people. The dream of a democratic, unified Korea, a dream many had held during the liberation celebrations of 1945, was slipping away. The 38th parallel was supposed to be a line of separation, but quickly became a battlefield in miniature. Patrols clashed, sometimes by accident, sometimes by design. Guerrillas sympathetic to the North infiltrated the South, sparking raids and reprisals. Southern forces launched counterattacks across the line, testing defenses. Each side blamed the other for the bloodshed. To the North, these were liberation efforts. To the South, communist infiltrations. Neither admitted their own provocations. The line, once drawn in pencil, was now being written in blood. By 1949, the stage was set. Two leaders, two visions, two futures, each claiming to represent the true Korea, each intolerant of compromise, each preparing for the day when words would give way to weapons. The peninsula, once unified by centuries of shared history, was now locked into a deadly rivalry shaped by personalities as much as by ideologies. Liberation had given way to division, and division was hardening into hostility. The storm was building. The parallel was holding, but only just. By the late 1940s, the Korean peninsula was more than a place. It was a pawn, a square on the chessboard of two emerging superpowers. For centuries, Korea had lived in the shadows of its neighbors, but now it was caught between Washington and Moscow, both locked in a rivalry that spanned continents. The United States, fresh from victory in World War II, viewed the spread of communism as the greatest threat to the free world. Korea, though far from Washington, mattered because it bordered China, sat close to Japan, and touched the Pacific lanes that America now considered its sphere of security. Losing Korea to communism, U.S. officials feared, would send a message that American power was fragile, that the dominoes of Asia could topple one by one. Moscow, under Joseph Stalin, looked at Korea through another lens. The Soviet Union had already secured Eastern Europe as a buffer zone, but Asia offered new possibilities. A friendly, socialist Korea would protect the Soviet Far East, extend Moscow's reach into the Pacific, and prove that communism could thrive beyond Europe. Korea was small, but symbolically large, a place to show the world that socialism wasn't confined to one hemisphere. The tragedy was that Koreans themselves were seldom in the room where their fate was discussed. Washington and Moscow treated the peninsula as a piece of territory to be aligned, not a nation to be heard. For Stalin and Truman, Korea wasn't about Korea, it was about the larger struggle of systems. Capitalism versus communism, freedom versus control. And so, both poured resources into their halves of the peninsula. The Soviets built up industry in the north, training cadres of loyal communists. The Americans bolstered the South with economic aid and military advisors. Two systems, two ideologies, two visions, all jammed into a land that had once been one. To understand why Washington cared so much about Korea, you have to understand containment. It was the guiding star of American foreign policy after World War II. The belief that communism must be contained wherever it appeared, lest it spread like wildfire. In Europe, containment meant the Marshall Plan, NATO, and Berlin airlifts. In Asia, it meant protecting Japan, securing the Philippines, supporting Chiang Kai-shek in China, and holding the line in Korea. American policymakers didn't see Korea as just another nation. They saw it as a litmus test. If the U.S. abandoned it, communists in Asia would be emboldened. If the U.S. defended it, the world would see American resolve. For Truman and his advisors, the choice wasn't really about Korean wishes. It was about credibility, reputation, the ability to demonstrate that the U.S. would not retreat in the face of communism. This policy filtered down into daily life and soul. Aid shipments arrived, grain, clothing, machinery, meant to stabilize the fragile economy. Advisors pushed for political structures that mirrored American democracy, though Rhee's authoritarian streak often bent them. U.S. Officers encouraged a strong police force, not only to maintain order, but to suppress communist activity. Every strike, every protest, every student demonstration was viewed not as local dissent, but as a possible communist plot. Containment turned the South into a fortress of suspicion. Anyone who questioned Rhee's government risked being labeled a communist sympathizer. Leftist groups were outlawed, sometimes violently crushed. To Washington, it was messy but necessary, better to tolerate Rhee's heavy hand than risk losing the South to socialism. But to many Koreans, containment didn't feel like liberation. It felt like living under constant watch, with ideology dictating whether you were safe or suspect. In Pyongyang, Kim Il-sung grew restless. By 1949, he commanded a disciplined army, backed by Soviet training and equipment. He had the loyalty of his people, or at least the appearance of it through propaganda. He had purged rivals and consolidated power. And he had one burning goal: to reunify Korea under his rule. But there was one problem: Moscow. Kim needed Stalin's approval to launch an invasion. Without Soviet support, he lacked the tanks, artillery, and political cover to succeed. At first, Stalin was hesitant. The Cold War was heating up, yes, but open war in Korea could draw on the United States. Stalin preferred to fight through proxy, to spread communism quietly rather than risk direct confrontation. He advised Kim to be patient, to strengthen his base, to let time do the work. Still, Kim was persistent. He traveled to Moscow, argued his case, promised a swift victory. He told Stalin that the South was weak, that Syngman Rhee's government was unpopular, that Southern communists would rise up as soon as Northern troops crossed the border. Kim painted a picture of quick success, a lightning war that would reunify the peninsula before Washington could react. Stalin wavered. For years, he held Kim back, but events elsewhere began to shift his calculus. In 1949, Mao Zedong declared the People's Republic of China after the Communists won the Chinese Civil War. Suddenly, Asia looked more promising for communism. The U.S., meanwhile, withdrew most of its troops from Korea, signaling to Stalin that perhaps Washington wouldn't fight for the peninsula after all. By early 1950, Stalin began to tilt. He gave cautious approval for Kim's invasion, supplying tanks, artillery, and advisors. The gamble was on. The hesitancy had faded, and with it, the peninsula moved closer to war. China's role was complicated. Mao Zedong had just triumphed in his civil war, establishing a communist government in Beijing. His victory electrified the socialist world and terrified Washington. But Mao's China was fragile, war-torn, poor, struggling to rebuild. When Kim approached Mao for support, Mao sympathized but hesitated. China was exhausted. Its armies were still consolidating control, its economy in ruins. Joining another war, especially against U.S.-backed forces, was risky. Yet Mao also knew that a communist Korea would strengthen China's northern border and give him an ally against American influence. For Mao, Korea was both opportunity and burden. He signaled support but urged caution, aligning with Stalin's hesitancy. Only when war broke out did Mao commit fully, sending hundreds of thousands of volunteers across the Yalu River to rescue the faltering North. But in the late 1940s, China played a waiting game, watching the chessboard shift before moving its pieces. Hovering above all this was the newly formed United Nations, born in 1945 with the hope of preventing another world war. Korea became one of its earliest tests. Could the UN enforce peace? Could it mediate between superpowers? The UN established commissions to oversee elections in Korea, but the effort faltered. The Soviets barred UN observers from the North, accusing the organization of being a Western tool. In the South, elections went forward under UN supervision, but they were boycotted by leftists and marred by violence. Still, the UN recognized the Republic of Korea in 1948, giving Rhee's government international legitimacy. The North, of course, rejected this outcome. With Soviet and later Chinese backing, it declared its own government, the Democratic People's Republic of Korea, claiming equal legitimacy. Thus, by 1948, Korea had two states, two armies, two leaders, and two seats of power. The UN's dream of a peaceful, unified Korea had failed. Instead, the peninsula stood as the Cold War's first major fault line. By the dawn of the 1950s, Korea was no longer just a local struggle. It was the first true flashpoint of the Cold War. The division of Germany in Europe symbolized the clash of East and West, but Korea was where the tension turned violent. Border skirmishes grew more frequent, propaganda more venomous, military buildups more intense. In Seoul, recalled for a march north to liberate the peninsula. In Pyongyang, Kim prepared his army for a lightning strike to the south. Both believed they were the true Korea, both ready to fight for it. For Washington and Moscow, the peninsula became a proving ground. Would communism expand unchecked, or would American resolve stop it? Would a new balance of power tilt east or west? For Koreans themselves, it was something far more personal. It was families divided, land lost, futures uncertain. It was the fear that liberation had been a mirage, replaced first by division, and now by the looming shadow of war. The chessboard was set. The pawns were in place. And soon, the first move would be made. Korea had become more than Korea. It was a symbol, a test, a prize in the rivalry of superpowers. Its leaders were pawns, yes, but also players in their own right, maneuvering under the gaze of Washington, Moscow, and Beijing. The peninsula stood at the edge of conflict, the parallel tense with soldiers, the people caught between ideologies they hadn't chosen. The Cold War had many fronts, but its first eruption would be here, on Korean soil. It was a Sunday morning, the kind of early summer day when farmers were tending rice paddies and church bells were calling families to service. At first light, the thunder began, not of weather, but of artillery. Along the 38th parallel, North Korean guns erupted, pouring shells southward in a barrage that seemed to shake the very earth. Soldiers who had spent the night in foxholes and bunkers stumbled awake to find themselves under a storm of fire. Then came the tanks. Soviet-made T-34s, veterans of World War II's battlefields, rolled forward in columns, smashing through barbed wire, trenches, and thin defenses. Behind them marched thousands of infantry, disciplined, determined, chanting as they advanced. This was no border skirmish like the dozens that had flared and faded in the years before. This was a full-scale invasion. In Seoul, the capital, few could believe it at first. Rumors flew. It's another provocation, nothing more. But by mid-morning, reports streamed in of entire southern outposts being overrun, of northern troops surging across bridges. The war that many had feared, the war that had always seemed one rash move away, had begun. By nightfall, the skies themselves seemed to tell the story. Black columns of smoke rose from towns along the parallel. Roads filled with retreating soldiers and terrified civilians. The line that had been drawn on a map 5 years earlier was no longer a political boundary. It was a battlefield. The assault was swift and overwhelming. The Korean People's Army, KPA, trained and equipped by the Soviets, numbered nearly 90,000 at the outset, with more than 150 tanks. The Republic of Korea Army, ROKA, by contrast, had only about 65,000 men, almost no armor, and little heavy artillery. It was a mismatch from the start. Northern troops moved with precision. Within hours, they had crossed multiple points along the parallel, cutting off southern garrisons, surrounding units, and forcing panic retreats. The T-34 tanks were nearly invulnerable to the South's small anti-tank weapons. Soldiers who had never seen armor before described the machines as monsters, invincible and relentless. Civilians caught in the path of the advance fled in waves. Families loaded carts with whatever they could carry, grain, blankets, a few chickens, and joined the human river flowing south. Some walked barefoot, others carried children on their backs. Old men leaned on sticks, women balanced bundles on their heads, children cried for food and water. The invasion was not only a military shock, it was a human catastrophe unfolding in real time. In Pyongyang, Kim Il-sung declared the start of the liberation of the South. His propaganda announced that the war would be over in weeks, that Seoul would be captured swiftly, that all of Korea would soon be united under his rule. The soldiers marching south believed it. The tanks believed it. And in those first days, the momentum made it seem possible. Seoul had seen armies before. It had fallen to the Japanese in 1910, then hosted American parades in 1945. But nothing prepared its citizens for June 1950. On the morning of June 27th, after only 3 days of fighting, the North Korean army entered the capital. Government officials, including President Syngman Rhee, had already fled south, abandoning ministries, records, and even families. Bridges over the Han River were dynamited in a desperate attempt to slow the northern advance. But the explosions came too late and too chaotically. Hundreds of civilians, still trying to cross, were killed in the blasts. As tanks rolled into the city, fear gripped the population. Some residents greeted the soldiers cautiously, uncertain whether to resist or welcome them. Others hid in basements, waiting for the noise to pass. Shops were looted, homes abandoned, refugees streamed out in every direction. For many in Seoul, the war felt like betrayal. They had believed in the Republic of Korea, however flawed, and in American protection. Yet here was the capital, abandoned within days, left to the mercy of northern soldiers. The city's fall so quickly, without a prolonged fight, sent shock waves through the south. If Seoul could collapse in 3 days, what chance did the rest of the country have? The highways south from Seoul became rivers of humanity. Tens of thousands, then hundreds of thousands, poured onto the roads, carrying what little they could. Ox carts creaked under loads of furniture and rice sacks. Mothers clutched infants, fathers herded children like livestock. Entire families trudged southward with no clear destination. Bridges across the Han and its tributaries became choke points of desperation. Soldiers and civilians crowded together, shoving forward under the fear that the structures would be destroyed at any moment. Some leapt into the river and swam, clutching bundles that dissolved in the current. Those too old or frail to move were left behind in heartbreaking scenes. Grandparents weeping on doorsteps as younger relatives pressed forward, promising to return but knowing they might not. The roadways grew littered with abandoned belongings, cooking pots, broken carts, even family portraits. Hunger stalked the refugees. Thirst did too. And all the while, the rumble of artillery in the distance reminded them that the front line was not far behind. This was not the migration of a few thousand. It was the movement of a nation. By summer's end, millions would be displaced, a people on the move in their own land, homeless in places that had always been home. In New York, far from the smoke and panic of Seoul, the United Nations Security Council convened. On June 25th, within hours of the invasion, the U.S. demanded action. The Soviet Union, normally ready to veto any Western move, was absent, boycotting the Council in protest of the UN's refusal to seat Communist China. Their absence was a twist of fate that would alter history. Without Moscow's veto, the Security Council passed Resolution 82, condemning the invasion and calling for immediate withdrawal of North Korean forces. When the attack continued, the Council passed Resolution 83, recommending that member states provide military assistance to South Korea. For the first time in its short history, the UN had authorized collective military action. In practice, this meant an American-led coalition, but it carried the legitimacy of international law. Troops from Britain, Australia, Canada, Turkey, Ethiopia, and many others would eventually join the fight. In Seoul and Washington, the decision brought a glimmer of hope. The South would not be abandoned. The world, or at least a significant part of it, was coming to its aid. But for now, hope was fragile. The North Korean advance was still relentless, and the UN's armies were weeks away from arriving in force. The invasion stunned American officials. For years, Korea had been considered a secondary theater. Secretary of State Dean Acheson had even delivered a speech months earlier suggesting that Korea lay outside the U.S. defense perimeter in Asia, implying it was not vital to American security. Kim Il-sung had read those words as a green light. Now, Washington scrambled to correct the signal. President Harry Truman convened emergency meetings. The lesson of Munich, appeasement leading to catastrophe, was fresh in policymakers' minds. If North Korea's aggression went unanswered, they feared communists everywhere would be emboldened. Truman made the decision swiftly. The U.S. would intervene militarily, not just with supplies, but with troops. It was a fateful choice, one that would commit America to 3 bloody years of war. In Tokyo, General Douglas MacArthur, Supreme Commander of Allied forces in Japan, was already preparing. His staff drew up plans for deploying American divisions stationed in Japan, while MacArthur himself flew to Korea to survey the collapsing front. He was characteristically confident, even arrogant, but even he admitted the situation was dire. Around the world, the invasion was seen as a test of the post-war order. Could the UN enforce peace? Could the U.S. contain communism? Or would the new balance of power tilt decisively toward Moscow and Beijing? For Koreans, though, the shock was more intimate. It was the sudden loss of homes, the thunder of tanks in their streets, the sight of flags changing yet again. The world debated ideology. They endured invasion. June 25, 1950, was the day the Cold War turned hot. What had been a tense standoff at the 38th parallel became a full-scale war. Within days, Seoul had fallen. Within weeks, the South was fighting for survival. The invasion was more than a military maneuver. It was a gamble by Kim Il-sung, a test for Washington, a crisis for the world. But for the millions on the peninsula, it was simpler and starker. It was flight and fear, separation and loss. The dawn guns had fired, and Korea would never be the same. The first weeks of the war were a rout. South Korean forces, ill-prepared and poorly armed, simply couldn't withstand the weight of the North's assault. Units melted away under the pressure of tank columns and artillery barges. Officers tried to rally their men, but without heavy weapons, without proper coordination, there was little hope. Soldiers abandoned positions, retreating southward in ragged lines, some without rifles, others barefoot from endless marching. In Seoul, the government had already fled. President Syngman removed south to Daejeon, then farther, watching his authority shrink with the shrinking map. His calls for resistance often sounded hollow against the reality of collapsing defenses. Civilians, too, lost faith in the army. They saw soldiers retreating, bridges blown behind them, villages abandoned to advancing northern troops. Rumors spread of entire divisions disintegrating after a single clash. For the North, victory seemed inevitable. Kim Il-sung promised reunification within weeks, pointing to the rapid southern collapse as proof that the people welcomed liberation. Propaganda trumpeted the weakness of the puppet army, and to many observers abroad, it looked as though Korea's fate had already been decided. But collapse was not the same as surrender. Amid the chaos, fragments of the South's army regrouped, digging in where they could, slowing the northern advance mile by mile. It was desperate, often hopeless fighting, but it bought time that would prove critical once foreign reinforcements began to arrive. When President Truman committed U.S. forces, it was no small decision. American soldiers, many of them fresh from occupation duty in Japan, were suddenly thrust into a war they hadn't expected. They arrived in Korea in July 1950, their first task simply to slow the northern advance. The first American units, Task Force Smith, were rushed into battle near Ozen. They were under-equipped, with only light artillery and a few bazookas that barely scratched the armor of North Korean T-34s. When the tanks rolled through their positions, the Americans were overrun, suffering heavy losses. It was a sobering moment. U.S. forces were not invincible, and the enemy was far more formidable than expected. But more troops followed. Entire divisions were shipped from Japan, bringing heavier artillery, tanks, and air support. The U.S. Air Force began pounding northern supply lines, strafing convoys and bombing bridges. Naval ships shelled coastal positions. Slowly, painfully, the balance began to shift, not enough to stop the advance, but enough to blunt it. South Korean soldiers, once scattered, rallied alongside the Americans. Joint units formed, languages colliding in trenches and command posts, yet bound by necessity. The presence of American troops gave hope that the South might survive after all. By August 1950, the war had compressed into a corner. Northern troops had swept down the peninsula, capturing Daejeon and pressing relentlessly toward the southeast. The Republic of Korea was shrinking by the day, and its last refuge was the port city of Pusan. There, a defensive line was drawn, the Pusan perimeter. Stretching roughly 140 miles from Naktong River in the west to the Sea of Japan in the east, it encircled the last stronghold of the south. Within it lay not only the remnants of the army, but also millions of civilians, refugees who had fled from every corner of the peninsula. Busan became a city of desperation, overflowing with humanity, its streets packed with families who had nowhere left to run. American and South Korean commanders knew this was the final stand. If Busan fell, there would be no retreat, no regrouping. The peninsula would belong to the north. The perimeter had to hold. The Naktong River became the crucible of the war. Wide and winding, it formed the western wall of the Busan perimeter. North Korean forces hurled themselves across it again and again, determined to break through. Battles raged at crossings with names like Naktong Bulge, where American and South Korean units fought tooth and nail against waves of infantry supported by tanks. The fighting was brutal, often hand-to-hand. Soldiers clashed in rice paddies, on ridge lines, in villages reduced to rubble. At night, the river shimmered with the lights of tracer fire, artillery shells bursting like thunderclaps across the water. The stench of death lingered, bodies of soldiers and civilians alike caught in the current. American firepower proved decisive. Artillery, tanks, and airstrikes shredded North Korean assaults. The 29 bombers dropped tons of explosives, leveling entire enemy concentrations. Yet the pressure never ceased. Every breakthrough was contested, every inch of ground fought over multiple times. Soldiers described the Naktong as a meat grinder, a place where lives were consumed to buy time. And time was exactly what was needed. Each day the perimeter held was another day reinforcements could arrive, another day supplies could be unloaded at Busan's harbor, another day closer to turning the tide. The lifeline of the perimeter was the sea. Busan's port became the artery through which survival flowed. American and Allied ships ferried in troops, tanks, trucks, ammunition, and food. Supplies arrived in a steady stream, unloaded by the thousands of tons. Without the harbor, the perimeter would have withered. With it, the defenders could endure. Naval superiority meant the North could not cut this lifeline. Their armies could batter the perimeter, but they lacked the ships to blockade Busan. The United States, by contrast, commanded the seas, ensuring that reinforcements kept pouring in. This advantage turned the perimeter into more than a last refuge. It became a fortress, replenished daily by the ocean. Civilians contributed too. Refugees in Busan worked unloading ships, repairing equipment, cooking meals for soldiers. Women carried water to frontline units, patched uniforms, and tended to the wounded. The entire city became part of the war effort, a hive of desperation and determination. For all the supplies, for all the reinforcements, the mood in the summer of 1950 was grim. Soldiers whispered that they were fighting with their backs to the sea, that there was nowhere left to go. Civilians feared that the perimeter would collapse, that Busan would be overrun, that the North's victory was only a matter of time. American newspapers carried dire headlines. Commentators predicted Korea would fall, just as China had to communism months earlier. Washington debated whether the fight was even worth it. Some argued the peninsula was too small, too distant, to justify heavy losses. But on the ground, the defenders fought with a kind of stubborn resolve. They knew collapse meant annihilation, so they clung to every hill, every bridge, every river crossing. Soldiers spoke of fighting not for strategy or ideology, but simply to survive the next day. And somehow, against the odds, the line held. August turned to September. The North's momentum slowed, then stalled. The Busan perimeter had not broken. Instead, it had become the anvil on which the North's offensive would shatter. The summer of 1950 was a season of desperation, of collapse turned into defiance. The Republic of Korea had been driven to the brink, cornered in a last patch of land. But the perimeter around Busan held, sustained by firepower, supply lines, and sheer will. What began as retreat ended as resistance. The war was far from over. Indeed, the most daring gambit was yet to come. But in those dark weeks, the South proved it would not vanish so easily. The peninsula had bent, nearly to breaking, but it had not snapped. By the summer of 1950, the Korean War seemed headed for disaster. The North had swept through Seoul, pressed the Republic of Korea and its American allies into a shrinking pocket around Pusan, and the survival of the South looked measured in days, not weeks. The perimeter held, but just barely. To many in Washington and Tokyo, the war was a defensive struggle. Hang on long enough, reinforce the line, maybe claw back ground inch by inch. But Douglas MacArthur was not a man for half measures. The general, already a legend from World War II, was commander of UN forces based in Japan. He was theatrical, arrogant, brilliant, sometimes all at once. Where others saw stalemate, MacArthur saw an opportunity for drama. He proposed something audacious, an amphibious landing far behind enemy lines, at the port of Incheon, west of Seoul. Instead of grinding north from Pusan, he would leapfrog the battlefield entirely, cut supply lines, and trap the North Korean People's Army, KPA, between two fronts. The idea was bold, but also reckless. Incheon was notorious for its 30-foot tides, among the highest in the world. Mudflats stretched for miles at low tide, leaving ships stranded. The approaches were narrow, the currents treacherous, the beaches unsuitable. Every military planner who looked at the maps shook their heads. One admiral quipped, "If I were asked to pick the worst place in the world for an amphibious landing, Incheon would be it." MacArthur, though, was undeterred. In a dramatic meeting in Tokyo, he sketched the plan before skeptical officers. He invoked history, his own wartime record, even divine providence. He argued that because Incheon was so unlikely, the North would never expect it. The very impossibility of the landing, he said, would make it succeed. In war, he told them, the element of surprise is priceless. His conviction won the day. Washington approved the gamble. The greatest amphibious operation since D-Day was about to unfold, not on the beaches of Normandy, but on the tidal flats of Korea. Incheon was no postcard harbor. It was a nightmare of mud and water. The tides rose and fell so dramatically that ships could only approach during narrow windows. At low tide, the port turned into a wasteland of muck, impassable to landing craft. Timing had to be precise. A delay of hours could strand entire units, leaving them exposed and helpless. The approaches were treacherous, too. Ships had to navigate a winding channel past islands and reefs, all within range of enemy artillery. Incheon itself was ringed by seawalls, not sandy beaches. Soldiers would have to scale them under fire. Beyond the harbor lay a maze of streets, rice paddies, and industrial zones, perfect for defenders. Every calculation screamed danger. Amphibious landings were notoriously risky, even under ideal conditions. At Incheon, the odds seemed stacked against success. Critics feared another Gallipoli, a bloody disaster that would cripple UN forces and doom Korea. And yet, the very risks were what MacArthur banked on. He believed the North Koreans had left Incheon lightly defended, never imagining an attack there. If the landing succeeded, it would slice their army in two, forcing a retreat from the south and recapturing Seoul in one stroke. It was the kind of maneuver that could transform the war overnight. Dawn broke over the Yellow Sea on September 15, 1950. Naval guns roared, blasting Incheon's defenses in a thunderous barrage. Columns of smoke rose from the shoreline as landing craft churned toward the seawalls. The first waves of U.S. Marines hit Wulmi-do, a small island guarding Incheon's harbor. They stormed ashore under covering fire, scaling cliffs, clearing bunkers, securing the high ground. The assault was ferocious but swift. By mid-morning, Wulmi-do was in American hands. Then came the main landing. Landing craft surged into the harbor as the tide crested, troops spilling out to climb the seawalls with ladders and ropes. Machine gun fire rattled from defenders, but the Marines pressed forward, tossing grenades over parapets, advancing block by block. Incheon's narrow streets became battlegrounds. Buildings shattered, tanks rumbled through alleys, civilians huddled in basements as gunfire echoed. By nightfall, the port was secure. Against the odds, the gamble had paid off. The Marines had carved a beachhead behind enemy lines, opening the door to Seoul. The cost was real, hundreds of casualties in brutal fighting, but far less than feared. Incheon, once deemed impossible, had become a stunning success. From Incheon, the advance inland was rapid. The landing had caught the North completely off guard. Their supply lines stretched thin, their troops deep in the South. They had little left to defend the capital. MacArthur pushed hard. Within days, UN forces swept east and south, cutting highways, seizing rail junctions, collapsing the North's logistics. Refugees once again flooded the roads, but this time they were joined by retreating Northern soldiers, abandoning equipment, fleeing before the advancing UN columns. By September 25th, just 10 days after the landing, Seoul was recaptured. American Marines and South Korean troops fought through its streets, house to house, driving out the last defenders. The city, battered and burned, raised the South Korean flag once again over its government buildings. The liberation was not without cost. Civilians suffered terribly during the battle, caught in crossfire, trapped in collapsing buildings, suspected of aiding the enemy. Seoul changed hands for the second time in 3 months, and its people bore the scars. But strategically, the victory was decisive. The tide of the war had turned. The Incheon landing was more than a victory. It was a catastrophe for the North. Cut off from their supply lines, KPA units in the South disintegrated. Soldiers who had marched triumphantly into Pusan weeks earlier now scrambled to escape northward, abandoning tanks, weapons, even uniforms. UN and South Korean forces surged out of the Pusan perimeter, linking up with MacArthur's forces advancing from the west. It was a classic pincer movement, trapping tens of thousands of Northern soldiers. Entire divisions surrendered or were destroyed. By October, the once mighty invasion force had been shattered. For the South, it was vindication. A nation that had nearly been erased now stood tall. Crowds in liberated towns cheered the returning army, waving flags, showering soldiers with food and flowers. The humiliation of retreat gave way to the euphoria of victory. For the North, it was disaster. Kim Il-sung's gamble had backfired spectacularly. The war he had promised would end in weeks now threatened to end in his defeat. In Washington, Tokyo, and Seoul, the mood shifted overnight. What had begun as desperate defense at Pusan now looked like triumph. Newspapers blared headlines. UN forces smash north. Seoul liberated. Victory near. MacArthur, never one to hide his confidence, declared that the war could be finished by Christmas. With the North in retreat, he pushed for a full advance across the 38th parallel, all the way to the Yalu River on the border with China. To him, unification was now within reach. American officials, buoyed by success, agreed. Truman authorized the advance with conditions to avoid provoking China, but the momentum seemed unstoppable. After the dark days of July and August, optimism reigned. The peninsula might be united after all, and communism expelled. Ordinary Koreans, too, believed. In towns newly liberated, people hung flags, sang hymns, wept openly. For families divided by the parallel, the dream of reunification seemed at hand. The nightmare of division, of occupation, of invasion, it might all be ending. But history is rarely so simple. The very success of Incheon, the very speed of the advance, was about to trigger a new and even deadlier phase of the war. MacArthur's gamble had paid off, dazzling allies and stunning enemies. Incheon was more than a battle. It was a turning point, a moment when despair turned into hope, when the tide of war reversed in a single stroke. Yet victories can be deceptive. In the glow of triumph, leaders forgot that Korea was not an isolated battlefield. Beyond the Yalu River lay China, vast and wary, watching every advance. The gamble at Incheon had won a battle, perhaps even a campaign, but it had also set the stage for the war's greatest gamble yet, the push to the north. By late September 1950, the battlefield looked utterly transformed. Only weeks before, UN and South Korean forces had been pinned inside the Pusan perimeter, fighting for survival. Now, with Incheon secured and Seoul recaptured, the momentum had swung violently. The North's once unstoppable drive south had collapsed into retreat. MacArthur, always bold and never cautious, pressed his advantage. He ordered a general advance across the 38th parallel, the line that had once been the dividing marker of two Koreas. What had been a border now became merely a waypoint. His intent was clear: destroy the North Korean People's Army, KPA, completely and reunify the peninsula under the Republic of Korea. South Korean troops were the first to cross the parallel in early October, banners waving, spirits high. For them, this wasn't just a military maneuver, it was liberation. Villages that had lived under the KPA for months greeted them with tears, cheers, and food offered from bear cupboards. Women clutched children, men clasped soldiers' hands, old people bowed and wept. Everywhere the army marched, people came out to see them, to believe again in the possibility of one Korea. Behind them rolled American units, armored columns kicking up clouds of dust. Tanks lumbered northward, infantry advancing steadily, air support roaring overhead. The United Nations flag flew alongside the stars and stripes and the Taegukgi, a strange coalition of symbols marching together. The speed was astonishing. Town after town fell without serious resistance. Northern troops, shattered by Incheon and cut off from their supplies, could not hold. For the first time in the war, the advance seemed effortless, as though the peninsula itself was opening its arms to be reunited. By mid-October, UN forces neared Pyongyang. The ancient city, with its mountains and rivers, had been the northern capital for 5 years. To take it would be more than a tactical victory. It would be symbolic, the toppling of Kim Il-sung's regime in its very seat of power. On October 19th, South Korean troops entered Pyongyang, followed soon after by American units. Resistance was scattered. Northern forces had already fled or been destroyed. The city, bruised by weeks of war, lay eerily quiet as tanks rumbled through its streets. Soldiers climbed rooftops and raised the flags of the Republic of Korea and the United Nations. Civilians emerged hesitantly. Some greeted the troops with cautious smiles, relief etched on their faces. Others hid, uncertain what this change of flags meant, wary of the cycle of occupation that had already torn their lives apart. But for the soldiers, Pyongyang's capture was triumph. They had marched into the enemy's heart, and the enemy had not stood. MacArthur's headquarters trumpeted the success. Photographs of smiling troops in Pyongyang splashed across newspapers worldwide. To many, it looked like the war was over. Kim Il-sung's government had vanished into the countryside. The KPA was in tatters. Victory seemed only a breath away. The advance didn't stop at Pyongyang. Flush with success, UN forces pressed further north, racing toward the Yalu River, the border between Korea and China. MacArthur envisioned nothing less than total unification. To halt now, he argued, would waste the sacrifice already made. Columns of troops trudged through mountains and valleys, pushing deeper into unfamiliar terrain. Autumn's chill set in. The air grew colder with each mile northward. Supplies lagged, but momentum drove them on. American officers spoke confidently of home by Christmas. Soldiers joked about finishing the war quickly, already imagining the trip back across the Pacific. But others grew uneasy. The closer the armies marched to the Yalu, the louder the warnings became. China had repeatedly signaled that it would not tolerate foreign armies on its border. Do not cross the Yalu, Beijing warned through intermediaries. MacArthur scoffed. He believed the Chinese were bluffing, too weak and too exhausted from their civil war to intervene. His eyes remained fixed on the river, the final prize of a peninsula united under Seoul. Civilians, meanwhile, watched with mixed feelings. In northern villages, some welcomed the advancing troops, hoping for peace at last. Others fled into the mountains, fearing reprisals or simply exhausted by the whiplash of shifting armies. Fields lay untended, homes abandoned, families scattered by the tides of war. By early November, UN patrols could see the Yalu itself. Across the water lay China, vast, looming, silent. The soldiers gazed across the river, some tossing pebbles into the current, others snapping photographs. Few realized that behind those hills, an enormous Chinese army was already massing. For ordinary Koreans, the sight of the armies moving north was electrifying. For 5 years they had lived with division. For months they had endured invasion and terror, and now, finally, there was hope of reunification. In towns along the advance, villagers lined the roads, waving flags, offering food to soldiers. Farmers slaughtered their few remaining pigs or chickens to feed liberators. Children ran alongside convoys, cheering, clutching at soldiers' hands. Old women knelt and prayed, thanking heaven that Korea might be whole again. For families divided by the parallel, the hope was visceral. Letters that had stopped flowing, visits that had ended, perhaps now they could be renewed. Brothers might embrace again, parents might see lost children. Unity, long dreamed of, seemed finally within reach. Yet beneath the joy was uncertainty. Every shift of power brought new dangers. Collaborators feared punishment. Families with ties to the North worried about reprisals. And always, there was the gnawing question, could this unity last, or would it be snatched away again? In Washington, success brought dilemmas. The original mission, authorized by the UN, had been to repel aggression and restore the 38th parallel. Now, with Pyongyang taken and the North collapsing, the mission's scope was in question. Should UN forces stop at the line and consolidate, or push to the Yalu and unify the peninsula? The debate was fierce. Some officials urged caution, warning that advancing into the North risked provoking China or even the Soviet Union. They argued that the mission had already succeeded, South Korea was saved. To go further was unnecessary and reckless. But others, led by MacArthur, pushed for total victory. To halt now, he insisted, would be cowardice. Communism had to be crushed in Korea, once and for all. His confidence, his record, and the intoxicating momentum of success swayed many. President Truman authorized the advance, but with a caveat, avoid provoking China. MacArthur brushed aside the warning. In his mind, China would not dare intervene. The war was already won, only mopping up remained. His certainty silenced doubts, but it also blinded him to the storm that was gathering. For Kim Il-sung, October 1950 was catastrophe. The army he had boasted would reunify Korea was shattered. His capital was lost, his soldiers retreating, his regime reduced to hiding in caves and villages. The speed of the UN advance stunned him. He turned desperately to Moscow and Beijing, pleading for help. Stalin was cautious, not wanting direct conflict with the U.S. But Mao, watching UN troops approach the Yalu, could not stand idle. Kim's defeat would leave China exposed, its new communist government vulnerable to American power on its very doorstep. As Kim clung to survival, China prepared to intervene, not with advisors or supplies, but with entire armies. The war, which had seemed nearly finished, was about to explode into its deadliest phase. The autumn of 1950 was a season of triumph and hubris. UN forces had turned defeat into victory, retreat into advance, despair into euphoria. They had crossed the 38th parallel, taken Pyongyang, and reached the Yalu itself. To many, the war was over, the peninsula saved, unification imminent. But history has a cruel rhythm. Just when victory seems certain, the ground shifts. Behind the hills of Manchuria, the People's Liberation Army was gathering in silence. The storm was about to break again, colder, fiercer, deadlier than before. Through the fall of 1950, Mao Zedong watched with growing alarm as United Nations forces, spearheaded by Americans and South Koreans, marched ever northward. The maps in Beijing told a story more threatening than any speech. By October, Pyongyang had fallen. By November, UN patrols peered across the Yalu River itself. And on the other side of that river lay Manchuria, the heartland of China's industrial recovery, its railways, its factories, its lifeline. Mao faced a terrible choice. China had only just emerged from a brutal civil war, communist victory over Chiang Kai-shek barely a year old. The country was exhausted, its economy shattered, its people still recovering from decades of Japanese invasion and civil strife. The idea of plunging into another war, this time against the United States and a coalition of nations, seemed insane. Many of his generals warned against it. The army is tired, they said. Our weapons are old. We can't fight the Americans. But Mao saw the stakes differently. He believed that if the Americans conquered North Korea and occupied the Yalu, China itself would be vulnerable. Foreign soldiers would sit on China's doorstep, just across the river. The same river that Japanese invaders had once crossed to attack. To Mao, it was not only about Korea. It was about China's survival and about the prestige of the new People's Republic. He made his decision. China would intervene. But officially, Beijing would not declare war. Instead, it would send volunteers. The world would soon learn what that meant. October nights along the Yalu grew bitterly cold. The river itself, wide and restless, formed the line between triumph and disaster. Across its bridges in the dead of night came columns of men, thousands upon thousands of Chinese soldiers. They moved silently, wearing padded cotton uniforms against the chill, their rifles slung, their feet wrapped in straw sandals. Trucks and wagons rattled over makeshift pontoon bridges. They carried little food, almost no heavy weapons, and relied on the simplest of supplies: rice balls, millet, and faith in their mission. Yet their numbers were staggering. Wave after wave, divisions melted into the Korean hillsides, vanishing into forests, caves, and ravines. The soldiers themselves called it the Great Crossing. By the end of October, hundreds of thousands of Chinese troops, officially the Chinese People's Volunteers, were inside Korea, unseen and unsuspected. American aircraft patrolled the skies, but the Chinese crossed at night and hid by day. Their camouflage was meticulous, their movements disciplined. The UN had no idea the scale of the force gathering in the mountains. They believed, at most, that small Chinese units might be assisting the retreating North Koreans. In reality, an entire army was waiting, crouched like a tiger in the brush, ready to strike. The blow fell in late October, in the rugged terrain near Unsan. There, South Korean divisions, supported by American troops, advanced north with confidence. Then, in the darkness, the hills erupted. Trumpets blared, bugles shrieked, gongs and drums pounded in the night. Out of the forest poured waves of Chinese soldiers, charging with bayonets, grenades, and sheer momentum. The suddenness was shocking. American soldiers had never faced such tactics. One moment there was silence, the next a wall of men crashing down. Entire units were encircled. A South Korean division was annihilated almost to the last man. American battalions were mauled, fighting their way out only by desperate retreat. This was the first taste of China's human wave assaults. The numbers seemed endless. A machine gun would cut down dozens, but still the line came on. And the bugles, always the bugles, sounded through the smoke, eerie and unrelenting. It rattled even veteran soldiers. One officer wrote later, "It was like the hills themselves came alive and fell on us." After a week of chaos, the Chinese withdrew as suddenly as they had appeared. The battlefield grew quiet again. UN commanders, confused, convinced themselves it was only a probing attack, perhaps 2 or 3 divisions. They reassured their troops and pressed forward again. They had no idea that the real storm had only just begun. In late November, as UN forces pushed further north, the Chinese struck again. This time, it was no probe. It was an avalanche. Near the Chosin Reservoir in the northeast, American Marines found themselves surrounded by tens of thousands of Chinese soldiers. Temperatures plunged to minus 30 degrees Fahrenheit. Weapons froze, vehicles stalled, men's breath crystallized in the air. The battle that followed was apocalyptic. Chinese troops swarmed down icy ridges, sometimes in waves so dense they looked like shadows moving across the snow. Marines and Army units fought back desperately, holding positions until their ammunition was nearly gone, then counterattacking with bayonets to break free. Casualties were enormous on both sides. The Chosin Reservoir became legend, the frozen Chosin. The Marines fought their way out, carrying their dead, rescuing their wounded, but they left behind the dream of a quick victory. Elsewhere, UN forces buckled under the onslaught. Entire regiments were routed. Columns streamed south, harried day and night by Chinese forces who seemed to multiply out of the dark. The proud advance to the Yalu reversed itself in weeks. It was not a retreat, but a race to survive, a shattering reversal that stunned the world. By December 1950, the unthinkable had happened. Only weeks before, American newspapers had predicted home by Christmas. Now, the UN command was in full retreat, and the Chinese tide was pouring south. Seoul once again lay in the path of advancing armies. Civilians packed belongings into carts, fled down icy roads, or simply huddled in terror. For the second time in 6 months, the city braced for invasion. On New Year's Day, 1951, the Chinese launched a massive offensive. Their bugles blared, their waves rolled forward, and UN lines broke. Within days, Seoul fell again. The capital had changed hands 3 times already, and the war was barely half a year old. The humiliation in the West was sharp. Victory had been snatched away at the very moment of triumph. Now, soldiers who had once dreamed of finishing the fight were grimly digging in, wondering how much further they would be pushed. The war, once thought nearly over, had become something else entirely, a grinding, uncertain struggle with no end in sight. The entry of China into the Korean War transformed everything. A conflict that had seemed close to conclusion turned suddenly into a nightmare. The world's mightiest military power, backed by the resources of a global coalition, found itself staggered by a country still reeling from civil war, but willing to throw its men into the furnace. Mao's gamble had paid off, at least in the short term. Kim Il-sung was rescued from collapse. The UN's dream of unification evaporated, and the war entered a new, darker phase, one of stalemate, attrition, and endless blood. For the soldiers on the frozen roads, there was no grand strategy, no politics, only survival. And as 1951 began, the Korean War shifted from lightning advances to something slower, more brutal, and far more uncertain. By the early months of 1951, the war had mutated yet again. Gone were the sweeping offensives of the summer and the stunning reversals of the fall. Instead, the Korean peninsula settled into a grim reality. Entrenched front lines, fortified ridges, and soldiers staring at one another across blasted valleys. After the shock of China's massive intervention and the second fall of Seoul, the United Nations command gathered itself. Reinforcements poured in, fresh American divisions, Commonwealth troops from Britain, Canada, and Australia, more contingents from Turkey, Greece, and Ethiopia. Supplies rolled up from Busan, now a humming hub of logistics. Commanders resolved. No more collapses, no more pell-mell retreats. The first test came in January and February 1951. Chinese and North Korean forces, emboldened by victory, launched relentless pushes southward. But this time, the UN stood firm. Strong defensive positions, better coordination, and sheer firepower turned the tide. Air superiority played its role too. American fighter bombers screamed overhead, hammering advancing columns. Slowly, inch by inch, the Chinese were bled white. By March, the UN armies counterattacked. Seoul changed hands for the 4th time, retaken by Allied forces. Yet the momentum stopped there. Neither side could land a decisive blow. The line solidified roughly along the 38th parallel, the very line that had divided Korea before the war. It was a bitter irony. After months of blood, sacrifice, and whole cities leveled, both sides had returned to where they began. With the broad maneuvers finished, the Korean War devolved into something hauntingly familiar to veterans of World War I. A war of attrition, fought over ridges, hills, and patches of ground with names like Heartbreak Ridge, Bloody Ridge, Old Baldy, and Pork Chop Hill. Imagine a ridge, steep slopes of mud and rock, scarred with craters, bare of trees from months of shelling. On one side, Chinese trenches. On the other, UN bunkers. Between them, a no-man's land of shattered earth, where any movement drew sniper fire. To take such a ridge meant sending battalions uphill under artillery barges, flamethrowers, and mines. It meant fighting yard by yard, sometimes hand to hand. And when the ridge was finally won, after days or weeks, another counterattack might seize it back. Heartbreak Ridge in 1951 became a byword for futility. American, French, and South Korean troops stormed it again and again, suffering thousands of casualties, only to find the Chinese dug in even deeper on the reverse slope. Bloody Ridge, as its name suggests, drained units until the ground itself seemed soaked in loss. The hills were never just hills. They were observation posts, artillery platforms, and propaganda prizes. Each one mattered, and so men died for them, over and over, while the front itself barely budged. If one sound defined the stalemate, it was artillery. Day and night, the thunder of guns rolled across Korea. Chinese batteries, hidden in caves and forests, hurled shells onto UN positions. American howitzers answered back, sometimes in coordinated, time-on-target barges, when dozens of guns fired simultaneously so that every shell landed in a single devastating instant. Soldiers grew numb to the bombardments. Trenches collapsed, dugouts caved in, barbed wire shredded. At night, the flashes lit the horizon like a storm without end. Some veterans later said the ground itself seemed to tremble, as though the mountains were breathing. The psychological toll was immense. Men huddled in foxholes for hours, waiting for the next shell, ears ringing, nerves frayed. Letters home often mentioned the strain, not only the fear of death, but the grinding, endless tension. One Marine wrote, "It's not the fighting that gets you, it's the waiting for the fight." In this new phase of war, daily life for soldiers was a strange mixture of monotony and terror. Long stretches of boredom, repairing trenches, hauling supplies, writing letters, were punctuated by sudden raids or bombardments. Winters were brutal. Temperatures plummeted, water froze in canteens, and frostbite claimed toes and fingers. Summers were no kinder, bringing swarms of flies, the stench of unburied dead in no man's land, and clouds of dust that clung to skin and uniforms. The front was not only a battlefield but a community of sorts. Soldiers built makeshift bunkers, carved out kitchens and dugouts, strung wire for field telephones. Radios crackled with jazz, country music, and scratchy broadcasts from home. Chaplains held services in ruined villages. Occasionally, both sides observed informal truces to retrieve the wounded or collect the fallen. Yet always, tension hung in the air. A patrol might vanish into the dark and never return. A shell could strike without warning. Sleep was shallow, meals rushed, nerves raw. The stalemate may have lacked sweeping battles, but for the men living it, the war was no less real. For the people of Korea, the stalemate brought no relief. Seoul had been captured, abandoned, and recaptured 4 times, and each time the city suffered new. Its streets were lined with ruins, its bridges blown apart, its people displaced again and again. Refugees crowded the roads, pushing carts, carrying children, searching for safety that never came. In the countryside, villages burned, fields lay fallow, and families lived in caves or makeshift huts. Disease spread, hunger gnawed, and winter claimed the weak. The war was not only fought on ridges, it was carved into the lives of millions of civilians who bore the brunt of its devastation. Stories filtered out, children orphaned, women separated from families, old men left behind when columns of refugees moved too fast. The resilience of the Korean people was remarkable. They rebuilt huts, planted fields amid shellfire, and clung to hope, but the scars of those years never fully healed. By late 1951, it was clear to commanders and soldiers alike. The Korean War had entered a new stage, one with no sweeping offensives, no dramatic collapses. Instead, the struggle will be measured ridge by ridge, artillery barrage by artillery barrage, casualty by casualty. For politicians and diplomats, this raised troubling questions. What was the war for now? Was it about defending South Korea, about punishing the North, about containing communism, or simply about not admitting defeat? Negotiations began at Panmunjom, but on the battlefield, the guns did not fall silent. The men on the front lines fought and bled, even as talks dragged on endlessly. The Korean War had begun as a lightning invasion. It had become a seesaw of victory and defeat. Now it settled into something worse, a grinding stalemate where time itself seemed weaponized, bleeding both sides without resolution. And so 1951 faded into 1952 with no clear end in sight. The soldiers dug in deeper, the civilians endured, and the diplomats argued. The war had become a waiting game, and it would test the endurance of nations as much as armies. High above the mountains and rivers of Korea, a new kind of war unfolded. For the first time in history, jet aircraft clashed in large-scale, sustained combat. The skies over the Yalu River, near the border with China, earned a name whispered with awe and dread: MiG Alley. The Soviet-built MiG-15 was a sleek predator. Fast, powerful, and armed with deadly cannons, it could outclimb and outgun most aircraft the United Nations initially fielded. Its swept-back wings gave it speed the world hadn't seen before. Chinese and North Korean pilots flew them in droves, though in truth many of the best pilots were Soviet airmen flying under false flags. their identities hidden to avoid open escalation. Against them stood the pride of American aviation, the F-86 Sabre. It was agile, rugged, and flown by some of the best-trained pilots in the world. Over Mig Alley, these two machines waged daily duels. Sabres swooped into the valleys, climbed through the clouds, and met MiGs head-on in whirling dances of death. Dogfights were fierce, sometimes lasting minutes, sometimes decided in seconds. Pilots described seeing tracers whip past their cockpits, feeling their jets shudder as G-forces pressed them into their seats. They came back shaken, drenched in sweat, hands trembling. The statistics were debated endlessly. American sources claimed kill ratios of 10 to 1 in favor of the Sabre. Soviet records painted a more even picture. But what mattered was that the air war had entered a new era. The piston-driven dogfights of World War II were gone. The jet age had begun in earnest, and Korea was its bloody testing ground. While the jet duels captured imagination, the real work of the air war was far less glamorous and far more destructive. UN bombers and fighter bombers pounded North Korean supply lines day after day. Bridges across the Yalu were bombed repeatedly, though Chinese engineers rebuilt them almost as quickly. Rail yards, convoys, and depots became constant targets. B-29 superfortresses, the same aircraft that had dropped atomic bombs just 6 years earlier, flew missions over Korea. They no longer had the luxury of uncontested skies. MiGs prowled, and flak batteries dotted the hills. Still, the bombers pressed on, escorted by Sabres, blasting railroads, dams, and factories. The goal was simple: starve the enemy of supplies. But Korea was a rugged land. Its narrow valleys and mountains offered cover, and Chinese laborers proved astonishingly fast at repair. A bridge bombed at dawn might be usable again by nightfall. Supply lines bent, twisted, and endured, fed by endless manpower. The bombers could never quite choke them off. No weapons symbolized the Korean air war more than napalm. Thick in gasoline, sticky and burning at unbearable heat, it was dropped from canisters by fighter bombers swooping low over villages, supply depots, and enemy positions. For soldiers caught beneath, napalm was terrifying beyond words. It clung to skin, seeped into trenches, and suffocated as much as it burned. Veterans recalled the smell, the screams, the way entire hillsides lit up like torches. Commanders praised its effectiveness, flushing enemies from bunkers, breaking attacks, denying cover. But the civilian cost was immense. Villages suspected of harboring enemy troops often found themselves engulfed in firestorms. Families fled into the fields, only to be caught by the rolling waves of flame. For many Koreans, the word napalm became synonymous with horror, a fire that destroyed not only bodies but trust, safety, and memory. Years later, historians and survivors would debate its morality. In the moment, it was simply another tool of war, brutal, efficient, and unforgettable. For Korean civilians, the air war was a nightmare. The sound of aircraft engines overhead could mean anything: food drops from UN planes to desperate villages, or bombs meant to obliterate an entire neighborhood. Children learned to recognize the silhouettes of planes, to distinguish a Sabre from a MiG, a bomber from a transport. Families dug shelters into hillsides, huddling as bombs fell. Refugees on roads were sometimes strafed by mistake, their carts and animals scattered in panic. Seoul, Pyongyang, and countless towns were reduced to rubble. Bridges that once carried farmers' produce to market became twisted steel. Rice paddies, the lifeblood of Korean families, were cratered by bombs and shells. The North bore the brunt, its cities shattered by relentless bombing campaigns. But even in the South, villages near the front lived under constant threat. No corner of the peninsula escaped the reach of warplanes. The Korean skies became a laboratory for technology. Radar-directed bombing, jet interceptors, early air-to-air tactics, all were tested and refined. The U.S. Air Force gained lessons it would carry into future wars. The importance of air superiority, the role of close air support, the deadly effectiveness of precision strikes when paired with ground coordination. For the pilots, these were not abstractions. They lived and died by seconds, by decisions made in split instants. A wrong maneuver meant a jet spiraling into the mountains. A bomb dropped a few seconds late meant a miss, or worse, civilian casualties. The new era of war was fast, unforgiving, and relentlessly modern. By 1952, the air war had hardened into routine. MiGs still prowled MiG Alley, but UN jets largely held the advantage south of the Yalu. Bombers kept pounding, napalm kept burning, and civilians kept suffering. The front lines on the ground had barely moved, but above them, the war was constant, roaring, and merciless. Pilots rotated in and out, their nerves frayed by combat. Some became aces, celebrated in newspapers back home. Others were shot down and captured, enduring long months in North Korean prison camps. Families in America, Britain, and elsewhere followed the stories of their boys in the skies. But for most Koreans, the planes overhead were not heroes. They were harbingers of fire. The Korean War's air campaign would shape doctrine for decades. But at the time, for those on the ground, it was simple. The skies themselves had become part of the battlefield, and there was no escaping them. Every war produces prisoners, but the Korean War added strange layers of politics, fear, and cruelty to captivity. Tens of thousands of men, Americans, South Koreans, British, Turks, and others, fell into enemy hands. On the other side, UN troops captured waves of North Koreans and Chinese soldiers. For those captured by the Chinese or North Koreans, life often became a nightmare. Marches to camps were long and brutal. Prisoners trudged in freezing cold, with little food or water, beaten if they lagged behind. Survivors recalled comrades collapsing on the roadside, too weak to continue, left to die in the snow. Inside the camps, conditions varied. Some were filthy, infested with lice, and starved of supplies. Prisoners struggled with disease, malnutrition, and despair. Others, though still harsh, provided minimal rations and allowed limited recreation. The difference often depended on local commanders or simply luck. But what made the Korean War's captivity infamous was not only physical suffering. It was the battle for the mind. During and after the war, the term brainwashing entered popular culture. American prisoners, subjected to constant indoctrination sessions, sometimes signed confessions or made radio broadcasts denouncing the war. The Chinese held classes, lectures, and study groups where captives were pressed to embrace communist ideology, or at least parrot it. Back home, these stories fueled alarm. Could American soldiers truly be reprogrammed? The word brainwashing became a Cold War buzzword, sparking fears that communists had found some sinister new psychological weapon. In truth, most prisoners resisted. Some played along to survive, mouthing slogans while privately dismissing them. A few cracked under pressure, exhausted and hungry. And yes, some became persuaded, or convinced themselves, that cooperation was safer than defiance. The effect was lasting. American society, in the 1950s, wrestled with questions of loyalty and fear of subversion. The Korean POW experience became wrapped in a larger anxiety. If soldiers could be turned, what about ordinary citizens? It wasn't only the prisoners who felt propaganda's pull. Both sides unleashed psychological warfare across the peninsula. Leaflets fluttered down from the skies by the millions. Some promised safe passage to defectors. Others warned of impending bombardment, urging civilians to flee. Loudspeakers blared across the front lines at night. Chinese broadcasts promised UN soldiers good treatment if they surrendered. American broadcasts mocked enemy leaders, blasted music, or spread rumors of betrayal. Sometimes, in the quiet between barges, soldiers on both sides listened with weary curiosity. Propaganda was as old as war itself, but in Korea it took on new intensity. It wasn't only about demoralizing the enemy. It was about shaping the global narrative, convincing the watching world that one side fought for freedom, the other for oppression. On the other side of the barbed wire, UN forces grappled with their own challenges. Thousands of North Korean and Chinese soldiers were captured during the shifting battles of 1950 and 1951. They were placed in camps on South Korean islands like Jeju. Here, control sometimes slipped from the guards' hands. Communist prisoners organized themselves, staging riots, assassinating fellow inmates suspected of sympathy for the South and resisting interrogation. At one point, they even captured an American general, using him as a bargaining chip before releasing him unharmed. The camps became battlegrounds of ideology as much as of discipline. Prisoners painted slogans, sang revolutionary songs, and sometimes turned violent. For the UN command, it was a bitter irony. Even in captivity, the war continued. If soldiers in camps paid with freedom, civilians across Korea paid with their lives, their homes, and their futures. Families were torn apart, fathers conscripted by force, children orphaned, women displaced into endless refugee columns. Villages in contested zones were destroyed multiple times. Farmers who had survived Japanese rule and dreamed of peace after 1945 now saw their fields cratered, their livestock slaughtered, their neighbors gone. One of the deepest wounds of the war was separation. When front lines shifted, families fled in opposite directions. The 38th parallel, which hardened into a border, froze that division. A mother in the South might never again see her son in the North. Brothers ended up on opposite sides of the trenches, fighting under different flags. The war did not just scar landscapes, it split bloodlines. By 1952, the human cost of the Korean War was staggering. Millions of civilians were dead, wounded, or displaced. Cities lay in ruins, rice fields untended, homes abandoned. For the soldiers, losses mounted with every hill fought over, every trench defended. The statistics tell part of the story. Tens of thousands of UN troops killed, hundreds of thousands of Chinese and North Koreans dead, millions of civilians caught in the crossfire. But numbers alone cannot capture the lived reality. The crying child separated from her parents, the prisoner wasting away in a hut, the farmer watching his land burn. These were the true costs. And beyond the numbers lay something harder to measure. Trust broken, lives forever divided, cultures reshaped by trauma. Despite all the leaflets, broadcasts, and slogans, the truth on the ground was simple. Soldiers wanted to live. Civilians wanted safety. Governments wanted victory, or at least to avoid defeat. The propaganda might dress the war in lofty ideals, but for those inside it, survival was the only ideology that mattered. Yet propaganda left a shadow. The fear of brainwashing, the narratives of heroic resistance or shameful betrayal, lingered long after the guns fell silent. The Korean War became not only a clash of armies, but a battle over stories, perceptions, and memories. By the end of 1952, the Korean War was fought as much in camps, leaflets, and hearts as it was on ridges and valleys. Prisoners struggled with survival and identity. Civilians bore the crushing weight of dislocation and loss. Propaganda sought to bend reality itself. This was the human face of the stalemate. Not sweeping offensives or great conquests, but individuals hungry, afraid, determined, caught in currents far larger than themselves. The battlefield might have frozen along the 38th parallel, but for the people living through it, the war remained painfully alive. By the summer of 1951, both sides understood something quietly. This war wasn't going to end with one glorious victory march. The front lines had stabilized, trenches dug in, casualties piling up with little to show. So, reluctantly, they began to talk. The first tentative negotiations were held in Kaesong, an old Korean city near the 38th parallel. Delegations from the United Nations Command and from North Korea, backed by China, sat across wooden tables, eyeing each other with suspicion. The issues on the table were enormous. Where would the final boundary be drawn? How would prisoners be exchanged? What guarantees could either side trust? And overshadowing all of it was the Cold War. Neither side wanted to appear weak before a watching world. The atmosphere was stiff. Delegates clung to rehearsed statements. Translators strained to convey both words and tone, and behind every sentence lurked the weight of Moscow, Beijing, and Washington. But even with so much at stake, the talks at Kaesong barely scratched the surface. It was, as one participant later recalled, like watching two people dance while both refused to take the first step. By October 1951, the talks shifted to a new location, Panmunjom, a tiny village that would become world famous. It was chosen for its neutrality, close to the front lines, but neither side's stronghold. There, in Spartan huts with wooden floors and tin roofs, negotiators met day after day, week after week. Journalists dubbed it the Talking War. The fighting never stopped on the battlefields, but here the war was waged with pencils, maps, and stubborn words. The process was painfully slow. Each side accused the other of stalling. When a clause seemed close to agreement, another dispute erupted. Even the shape of the negotiating table became an argument: round, square, or rectangular. Each choice carried symbolic weight. This was diplomacy at its most grinding, a war of attrition in suits rather than trenches. The single most contentious issue was prisoners of war. Normally, international law dictated simple repatriation. Captured soldiers returned home when the war ended. But in Korea, things were different. Thousands of Chinese and North Korean prisoners in UN camps refused to go back. Some feared execution if returned. Others had genuinely embraced anti-communism and sought a new life in the South. Meanwhile, UN prisoners held in the North were paraded for propaganda or forced to confess, but their fate too remained uncertain. This created a moral and political minefield. Could the UN really force prisoners back to countries they dreaded? Could China and North Korea accept an armistice that allowed their captured troops to defect? The debates raged for months. Delegates circled the issue endlessly, each side unwilling to lose face. The war became not only about territory, but about human lives stuck between two worlds. While negotiators sweated in Panmunjom, the real strings were pulled far away. In Washington, President Truman struggled with a divided public. The firing of General Douglas MacArthur in April 1951 had shocked America. MacArthur had wanted to escalate, bomb Manchuria, blockade China, maybe even consider nuclear weapons. Truman, fearing a global war, said no. The backlash was fierce. Many Americans saw stalemate as weakness. Meanwhile, Beijing juggled pride and practicality. Mao Zedong could not afford to look humiliated. China had poured hundreds of thousands of volunteers into Korea, and any compromise had to appear as victory at home. But prolonging the war drained resources and threatened domestic stability. Moscow played its own careful game. Joseph Stalin encouraged the conflict, hoping to keep America bogged down in Asia while Europe remained vulnerable. Yet he avoided direct confrontation, preferring to let Chinese troops and Korean proxies bear the burden. Soviet pilots flew in MiGs, but officially, the USSR denied involvement. Every statement in Panmunjom was weighed against these political realities. No delegate could concede without risking a storm back home. As talks dragged on, the front lines remained brutal. Soldiers fought over ridges and hills with names like Porkchop Hill, Bloody Ridge, and Heartbreak Ridge, small patches of ground that cost hundreds of lives, gained or lost only to be abandoned weeks later. The paradox was maddening. Soldiers bled for land that negotiators debated over in tents just miles away. Civilians fled villages that had already changed hands multiple times. And through it all, the talks crept forward at a snail's pace. Sometimes negotiations broke down entirely. Delegates stormed out. Meetings were suspended for weeks. When they resumed, the same arguments reappeared. By late 1952, it seemed the war might drag on forever. Change finally came from unexpected quarters. In the United States, Dwight D. Eisenhower won the 1952 presidential election. A war hero of World War II, he campaigned on a promise to go to Korea and seek an end to the stalemate. Eisenhower's approach was firm but pragmatic. He was willing to hint at expanding the war, even hinting at nuclear options, but his real goal was leverage. The message was clear: the U.S. was serious about ending this conflict one way or another. At the same time, in Moscow, Stalin's death in March 1953 shifted the balance. His successors were less invested in endless war. They sought breathing space to consolidate power at home. Without Stalin's iron grip, Chinese and North Korean leaders had more room to maneuver toward compromise. The international chessboard was changing, and with it, the tone at Panmunjom. By mid-1953, exhaustion had set in. Both sides had bled enough. The deadlock over prisoners was resolved with a compromise. Those who refused repatriation would be handed to a neutral commission and allowed to choose their fate. On July 27, 1953, the armistice was signed in Panmunjom. The war ended not with parades or triumph, but with pens scratching paper in a small village hut. The guns fell silent along the 38th parallel. The line across Korea remained almost exactly where it had been when the war began. 3 years of fighting had changed borders little, but had changed lives immeasurably. The Korean War proved that modern wars might not end in victory or surrender, but in compromise, in stalemate, in words hammered out across tables. Diplomats at Panmunjom showed that sometimes peace is not won, but grudgingly accepted. It was an unsatisfying end. Soldiers wondered if their sacrifices had mattered. Civilians looked at shattered homes and wondered what peace even meant. Politicians claimed victory, though few believed it. But the alternative, more years of slaughter, was worse. So, with signatures and uneasy handshakes, the war paused. Not ended, paused. Because technically, the Korean War never ended at all on July 27, 1953, when the armistice was signed at Panmunjom. There was no ticker tape parade. No triumphant speeches declaring absolute victory. Instead, there was silence, weariness, and a deep sense that nothing had truly been settled. The Korean War ended not with peace, but with a pause, a ceasefire that, technically, still holds today. The armistice created the Demilitarized Zone, DMZ, a strip of land 5 miles wide stretching across the peninsula. Ironically named, it became one of the most militarized borders on Earth, lined with barbed wire, minefields, and watchtowers. Families torn apart by the war were now permanently separated by a frontier they could not cross. The 38th parallel had gone from a rough administrative line to a hardened scar, slicing a nation in two. For the soldiers who fought, the end felt anticlimactic. They had suffered and bled, taken hills, and lost them again, only to learn that the border looked nearly the same as it had in 1950. For the civilians, there was only exhaustion, cities in ruins, fields burned, millions displaced, and countless loved ones missing. The war cemented the split of Korea into two nations with starkly different paths. In the south, Syngman re-ruled with iron determination. He promoted himself as the defender of freedom, though his government tolerated little dissent. South Korea remained poor, fragile, and politically unstable in the 1950s, its democracy shaky and often overshadowed by authoritarian control. Yet, in time, the South would transform, first through rapid economic growth, later through democratization. In the North, Kim Il-sung emerged stronger than ever. With the backing of the Soviet Union and China, he consolidated power into a cult of personality that would last for decades. The North rebuilt under a system of rigid state control, propaganda, and isolation. Unlike the South, its path narrowed into dictatorship and self-reliance, what would later be called Juche. For ordinary Koreans, the tragedy was personal. Brothers who had fought on opposite sides never saw each other again. Parents lost children across the border. Letters could not pass. What had once been a single cultural and historical nation became two worlds, each raising generations who knew the other only as enemy. The Korean War was not just a local conflict. It reshaped the Cold War itself. For the United States, the war was a rude awakening. After World War II, many Americans hoped for peace and retrenchment. Korea shattered that illusion. Defense budgets skyrocketed. The U.S. expanded its global military commitments, forging alliances like SEATO and strengthening NATO. Permanent bases appeared across Asia, from Japan to Okinawa to the Philippines. For China, the war was a coming-out party. Mao Zedong's new regime, barely a year old when the war began, had thrown itself against the world's most powerful military and survived. China's sacrifices, hundreds of thousands of lives, gave it prestige in the communist world and hardened its rivalry with the United States. For the Soviet Union, the war was a mixed bag. Stalin had managed to bog down the Americans without a direct clash, but the cost in resources was high. After his death in 1953, his successors began to rethink the wisdom of proxy wars that dragged on without decisive victory. And for the United Nations, the war was both a triumph and a burden. It had mobilized a multinational force to repel aggression, proving that collective security could work. But the heavy price in lives and the lack of a decisive peace also revealed the limits of such coalitions. In the West, Korea quickly became known as the Forgotten War. Unlike World War II, with its clear villains and final victory, or Vietnam, with its protests and controversy, Korea sat uneasily in the middle. It had no satisfying ending, no Hollywood-ready narrative. Veterans came home to little fanfare, their sacrifices overshadowed by the memory of the last war and the distractions of peacetime prosperity. Yet forgotten does not mean unimportant. The Korean War set the template for Cold War conflicts to come. Limited wars fought through proxies, ideological battles over small nations, and drawn-out stalemates that tested political will as much as military strength. In many ways, Korea was the first true Cold War war. Numbers alone tell a grim story. Millions of Koreans dead or displaced, more than 36,000 Americans killed, hundreds of thousands of Chinese soldiers lost, cities flattened, infrastructure destroyed, and generations traumatized. But the real legacy was the human one. In both North and South, families still remember missing brothers, sisters, and parents. Refugees rebuilt lives in strange cities, never knowing the fate of those left behind. The war became part of family folklore, told in whispered stories of hunger, escape, and survival. Even today, when rare family reunions are arranged across the DMZ, elderly Koreans weep as they see siblings or spouses for the first time in 60 or 70 years, sometimes only for a few hours before parting again. The war's division was not just political, it was intimate, cutting into the fabric of daily life. The Korean War taught the world that even superpowers had limits. The United States, with its overwhelming firepower, could not force unification. China, with its endless waves of manpower, could not conquer the South. The Soviet Union, powerful behind the scenes, could not dictate the outcome entirely. The result was a lesson that haunted strategists for decades. Nuclear powers could not fight each other directly without risking annihilation, so wars would be fought on the edges, in smaller nations through proxies and negotiations. Korea was the grim rehearsal for Vietnam, Afghanistan, and countless smaller conflicts where ideology, pride, and power clashed on someone else's soil. The armistice of 1953 was meant to be temporary. A peace treaty was supposed to follow. It never did. To this day, North and South Korea are technically still at war. The DMZ remains a tense line, where soldiers from both sides stare at each other across barbed wire and minefields. And the legacy of that war shapes geopolitics even now. North Korea's drive for nuclear weapons, its suspicion of the outside world, its rhetoric of resistance, all trace back to the Korean War. South Korea's fierce commitment to defense, its alliance with the United States, its determination to thrive despite threats, all are rooted in those bitter years. The world may call it forgotten, but the peninsula has never forgotten. The Korean War lingers in memory, politics, and the shape of the land itself. When people say the Korean War was forgotten, perhaps what they mean is that it never ended neatly enough to remember properly. It was not victory, not defeat, not quite peace, not quite war. It slipped into history like a wound that scabbed but never healed. Yet for those who lived it, soldiers in trenches, prisoners in camps, civilians fleeing villages, it was unforgettable. And for the divided Korean nation, it is still present, every day, in the reality of a border that slices families, language, and shared memory in two. The Korean War may have ended in 1953 on paper, but in truth, it never really ended at all.